How it happened, no one knew, and yet it didn't matter. Somehow the dinosaurs had reappeared. Somehow they had simply returned, born again from an unseen anomaly that couldn't be explained by science. And it wasn't just dinosaurs. It was every form of extinct life, prehistoric or modern, plants as well as animals. As the anomaly spread like a virus, human civilization was slowly overwhelmed and it collapsed. The natural order of things was then thrown into chaos as a free-for-all for survival between all species began. Dinosaurs suddenly hunted unprepared modern animals. Prehistoric trees the size of weeds tried to compete with massive redwoods that blocked much of the sun from reaching the ground. And humans faced an apocalypse on a scale unlike anything their species had seen since the Ice Age, if such a comparison was even fair. Some species that had become extinct once reappeared and vanished back into extinction again, along with some modern-day species that could not survive in such a world. What was left was a mix of all of the life forms that had ever lived on the planet. Ancient and modern animals now lived side by side. The Earth had witnessed its sixth mass extinction event, though it was unlike anything that anyone had predicted. It wasn't the climate, it wasn't pollution, it wasn't overhunting. It was simply an unexplainable anomaly. This story begins just before this unstable period and then follows what happened next. In a world overrun with dinosaurs, can humanity survive with them and itself, or are we doomed to the extinction by the claws of the previously extinct? Prelude, Nick's Journal. This story began on the unassuming day that I found an egg in the forest while out on a hike. It was just sitting on an old rotting log, alone, and almost seemed to have simply materialized there. During the following days, I tried to find out what had laid the egg, but after a few days of research, the only thing that I found was that there was nothing anywhere in western Ohio, or all of Ohio, that laid eggs as big as the one that I'd found. Not even eagles laid eggs that big. After checking in on it for several days and seeing no change around it at all, I decided that it was abandoned and I took it home. I was simply too curious at that point to just forget about the whole thing. I wanted to see what would hatch from it. When it hatched, not a very long time afterward at all, it turned out that there was a reason the whole thing seemed so strange. What hatched out of that egg was a real baby dinosaur. Specifically, the hatchling was a Spinosaurus. I realized that before the end of the world as we once knew it happened, that this news I'm delivering would have been earth-shattering. Guess I'm just used to him and dinosaurs as a whole now. Like everyone else still alive in this post-apocalyptic world of chaos that we all live in now. I named him, the hatchling, Spino. I know, I'm very creative with names. He became my best friend. I raised him, and he spent his first year living in my house. But when he grew too big, he had to move outside. From then on, he lived in the woods just behind my house, though this almost didn't happen at all. Now, I don't think that my first thought was to raise the little prehistoric carnivore as if he were a puppy. When I first realized what had hatched from that egg, I panicked. Personally, I think it was a reasonable reaction to seeing a living dinosaur. I didn't want any part of keeping and raising a dinosaur, or any part in whatever voodoo was going on, and had gone to my garage to get a hatchet, intending on killing the dinosaur before it grew big enough to eat me. Then I was going to bury my head in the sand and forget this whole thing ever happened. But when I had gone back to my living room, where he had hatched, I saw the baby looking at me with large eyes, radiating nothing but trust, love, and curiosity. That look, that adorable little look, was enough to make me stop. Sounds rather cliche, but it's true. And from that day on, I was suddenly a father. I still feel like an ass, though, whenever I think about what I almost did. When Spino had grown into a full adult, I did tell him about it. He didn't take it well, but understood my reaction, and thinking about it from my point of view, and after a tense week, where we kept our distance from one another, we both made peace with the fact of what I'd nearly done. Yes, he understood me when I told him. I found out very quickly that he was not exactly what you'd think of as a normal dinosaur. He was an enigma, within a situation that was already an enigma, and I'll explain why once I add a little more context about my life with him. When I was home from university and wasn't studying for my degree in advanced animal biology, I would spend all of my time with Spino. Being an introvert ever since an early age, I found socializing with the dinosaur, who doesn't judge me, much easier than spending my time hanging out with humans that do. It was like how your beloved dog never judged you, though in my situation the beloved sidekick could actually understand me. And dinosaur or not, Spino was perfectly safe to be around. You see, Spino wasn't what you would call a normal dinosaur, not even a normal member of his respective species. Aside from the whole being around in our modern age thing, he didn't have the eel-like tail that we know Spinosaurus had, and he was bigger than any known Spinosaurus fossils were. He walked upright, on his powerful hind legs most of the time, but was also perfectly comfortable dropping down and walking on all fours. In addition, he seemed to have a much stronger bite force than a Spinosaurus was thought to have. Also, the big guy was smart. And since I want this to be a full record of where things started and where they are now, I'll go into a little further detail. He could talk. As you know, based on what we all saw when civilization collapsed, there were rare exceptions of reborn prehistoric life that, for reasons we still don't know, could talk. They also had the same imaginative, high-powered brains that people do. Spino happened to be one of those rare examples. Spino lived in my house for about the first year. Despite college taking up the majority of my time, I was still able to raise him. Since I lived alone in the country, in a large forest that I think was state-owned land before, the company Spino provided me was genuinely nice, and some of my favorite memories were from that point in time. I remember the first time Spino heard thunder. He'd practically torn the blankets on my bed apart as he tried to bury himself under the covers next to me. It couldn't have been more of an opposite to the time that I first let him swim in the pool on my back deck. It was one of those nice underground pools, and he zipped around under the water for hours. He had no interest in sitting with me at all for that entire day. I had to put a leash on him and get him to come back inside when it started getting dark. I remember another time, I think Spino was around 4 months old and about the size of a chocolate lab, when he jumped up on my kitchen island, at which I was sitting, and begged me to let him try my coffee. After a few seconds of begging, he must have decided that I was taking too long to answer, because he just stuck his snout right into my mug and took a big slobbery drink. He made a huge mess. Though, let me just say, a hyper baby Spinosaurus getting a caffeine high was one of the funniest things I have ever seen in my life. He really was my best friend, and the only living thing that had ever been in my life that I'd give the honor of calling my family. So putting the hatchet back where I grabbed it from on the day that he hatched was the best thing I'd ever done. After remembering all of this, I'm gonna have to give him a treat now just to show how much I appreciate him. He loves a good chin scratch and almost acts like a giant dog, talking murderous dog with a sail on his back when I give him a treat. Not a characteristic you might expect from such a large dinosaur, but it's strangely adorable. On top of that, Spino had a very openly blunt personality. If he wanted to say something, then he would. Once he had grown too big and had to move out of my house and into the forest, at about a year old, I'd visit him every day. We loved spending time together out there, especially when we'd explore far and wide. I have many more fun memories from that time, finding all manner of interesting things deep in those woods. You could find waterfalls, abandoned buildings, caves, and all sorts of interesting things in those hills and trees. Living where I did meant keeping his existence under the world's radar was also relatively easy, not that he had a desire for the world to know about him. But now that you have an idea of who I am and who Spino, my large, fun-loving, adopted dinosaur son is, I'll start talking about how things went wrong. First, I do want to add that one other activity we both enjoy is stargazing. Spino didn't, and still doesn't, fully understand what a galaxy is, but that doesn't bother him. All he cared about was that the night sky was beautiful, and the nights that it was fully visible were his favorite period to be awake. On nights like this, he would just look at it for hours. I'd always point out various stars, planets, and galaxies to him, and tell him what they were specifically. Spino's eyes, while stargazing with me, were always so bright. They twinkled with curiosity. Spino always searched out galaxies in the night sky, the Milky Way, Andromeda, more distant neighbors, orbiting dwarf galaxies, or things much closer to home like the moon. To him, it didn't matter. They all fascinate him. Me, I always end up trying to spot Jupiter, mostly because its moon Europa is what always deeply fascinated me, what made my mind wander. Although with how things are in the world now, sadly I'll never live to learn if life is actually there. As a kid, I'd actually dreamed about being the first human to step foot on that frozen moon and finding what alien life swam in its hidden ocean. But it's likely no one will ever leave this planet again. Humanity was born here, and we'll all die here as well. Like everything before us, it's a rather poetic truth. And as a kid, I too had similar bright eyes when stargazing that Spino now has when he looks up into the deep void of space. I might still have that sparkle today too, who knows. This is just a quick little additional note, but I felt it was worth mentioning and I'd forgotten to add it before. It was over 2 years after Spino hatched that I first started seeing signs that something was not right. The apocalypse really had a slow burn, building up over a few years before the fuse that destroyed civilization over a few months was ignited. Dinosaurs and other extinct animals went from extinct to rare to overwhelming human civilization and sent the world into unstable anarchy. I have a lot to cover, so in all probability my journal will span multiple entries. Since I'm only recording key events, I'm going to try to keep it short and just hit the main points, which still leaves much to tell. The morning the anarchy had started began perfectly normal. I'd finished my morning coffee, listened to an updated report about a new serial killer operating in the Ohio River region, and had just stepped out of my house onto the back porch near my pool, only to be snatched up in one of Spino's large, clawed hands. He had been waiting just outside of my door, his demeanor was odd, and he didn't respond to my questions. So I just let him carry me to wherever he was going. I mean, can you argue with a Spinosaurus if it wants to take you somewhere? Another thing I noticed at the time that caused me to just let it happen was his body language. It was strangely urgent, in a way I hadn't seen before. Primal, maybe. Eventually, after he carried me a fair way off into the forest, he set me down and I saw what was affecting him. Let me quickly interrupt here for a moment because I want to add that this record might be inaccurate in a few spots. I'm writing all of this from memory, and it's been roughly a year since the main events I'm writing came to their conclusion, and even longer since the events I'm reviewing now occurred. Yes, I realize I had forgotten to mention that. I suppose I didn't think the information was needed at the time. I'll try to keep any further interruption to a minimum. Again, I want this to be as clear, as comprehensive, and as complete as possible. Going off memory, here is what happened next, as well as what happened over the next few months. Remember what I already said, I'm only focusing on the big events, for the most part. So what was it that had affected Spino so much? A set of dinosaur tracks. A set of dinosaur tracks that he hadn't left behind. And they were big, too. I was hunting here last night, Spino had explained to me as I examined them, and found this trail. I tracked it here, but it crossed the stream and I lost the scent. I remember that when I looked on the other side of the stream, the forest was much denser and looked rather foreboding. We decided to cross and explore. Another dinosaur being in the area was worth investigating. As I said before, I was able to keep Spino a secret from the world easily enough, because I didn't want to risk him being exploited by opportunists. I do not want to deal with the red tape that would inevitably come from such a revelation. Nor did I feel confident people could manage the wide revelation of a dinosaur being alive. But would a second dinosaur cooperate with that agreement? That kind of relationship? Was it even my responsibility at all? Did it even matter? Spino willingly went along with being kept a secret. Again, he had no desire to go anywhere that wasn't with me, nor did he want to be subjected to the kind of attention he'd receive were he revealed. If another dinosaur was suddenly in our world as well, then surely it was inevitable that people would find out, whether if it cared if they did or not. Those were my questions, among many others. Before we could answer any of them, we'd have to find it, whatever the new arrival was. Upstream, the water was shallow and fast-flowing, but in the spot where we stood, it was much deeper. So I had to climb up onto Spino's back, and then he waded across. Once we got to the opposite bank, I then jumped off of Spino and moved to the tree line, telling him I'd look ahead and that he could catch up once he was able to push through the tightly packed trees. I vividly remember Spino not liking the idea, but I went ahead anyway. Though I do admit, I was nervous about pushing ahead alone, but my curiosity got the best of me in the moment. After shoving my way through the trees, I realized what a bad move I had made. It just embarrasses me now as to how blind to danger I was back then. I found myself in a clearing, and sleeping in the center of it was, as expected from the tracks it left, another dinosaur. Now, at the time, that was earth-shattering, tracks or not. Little did I know that finding the dinosaur was just the precursor to what would come in the next months. The dinosaur in question was a large, thinly feathered Tyrannosaurus Rex. Without a doubt, seeing that creature was the single biggest, oh shit, moment I've ever had in my life. It seemed impossible, despite the fact I saw a living dinosaur every day, that I was looking at an actual Tyrannosaurus. That dinosaur was something that a human should not be able to behold. A fearsome force of brutal power and strength unlike any other that had ever lived. A force from which humans were supposed to be safely separated from by over 60 million years. The dinosaur was a huge, fully grown adult, a bull. I knew enough about Tyrannosaurus that it was definitely a fully grown specimen based on the size, but it was not big enough to be a female. My less than silent entry into the clearing had awakened it. Its eyes were gazing right at me. I remember that predatory look with searing accuracy. They were the type of eyes you see on the monster in your nightmares. There was no deeper emotion or thought like with Spino. There was just hungry instinct behind those pupils. Those menacing eyes are burned into my brain and are forever in my nightmares. T-Rex stood up, realizing easy prey was in the clearing, and roared. It was a giant, hungry dinosaur, and I'd walked right up to it. I might as well have rung the dinner bell, rubbed seasoning all over myself, and laid down on a silver platter for it. As the Tyrannosaur stalked towards me, I had confirmed what its eyes had told me already. This one definitely could not talk. You might ask why I didn't run. Well, you see, when someone is in a situation like I was, their brain chooses either flight or fight, but it can get stuck between them, and when it does, you just freeze up. That's what happened to me. I froze on the spot, and just as I was about to be breakfast for a T-Rex, the trees to my left were smashed. Spino, he pulled himself into the clearing, shoving past the last trees, then reared up on his tall hind legs and roared. The Rex turned to face him and roared in response, stalking towards Spino with powerful confidence. The Rex charged without pause towards the new threat, and there the standoff ended. I watched Spino drop onto all fours with a thunderous boom, then dodged to the side, avoiding the Rex's attack. In return, He had swiped at its head with his arms, and one of the swipes struck the Rex's left eye. The T-Rex roared again as its eye was gouged out of its skull in a gory mess. Shaking its head in response to the pain, Spino then went for its throat. Spino was trying to do was blind the Rex so it couldn't stop his following attacks or make use of its powerful jaws. The Rex saw Spino coming and dodged his bite. Instead, it was the one to bite onto Spino's neck. Spino kept his footing and slashed its other eye out with those large claws growing out of the tips of his fingers and tore himself free from the bite, though not without receiving some deep, bloody puncture wounds from the Rex's teeth. I remember just standing still, frozen between fight and flight, as I watched Spino as he then dropped onto all fours again and jumped upwards with a powerful lunge from his legs, biting the Rex's neck from below. He pushed up and kept pushing until the Rex stumbled, and the motion of its falling, combined with how Spino was holding it, caused its neck to audibly snap. Spino opened his jaws and the limp corpse dropped to the ground with a thunderous boom. That thundering crash that it had made upon hitting the ground was something you have to hear with your own ears to be able to understand. I could never describe it accurately with words. I can only say the force was so physically vivid and its power so overwhelming that I stumbled a little bit as the ground shook while shockwaves blasted through it. And there was silence, and I remember it just as vividly as the boom. Not even a stray summer songbird was singing away in the surrounding trees. It was like the modern animals couldn't understand what show they'd just been witness to. A bear might have been the largest animal the birds and deer around here had ever seen, not these giant, towering behemoths from well over 60 million years in the past. After the fight was done and I regained my footing, I unfroze at last and quickly walked over to Spino to make sure that he was okay. Thankfully, he was just fine. He let me check his wounds, and none were life-threatening. So we then turned our attention to the Rex and examined it. Its teeth were still bared in a snarl, and its eyes were blank but glassy. After several minutes of taking in the impossible, I looked at Spino and asked, "How is it here?" Spino's reply simply had been, "I don't know." What we learned that day was that Spino was not the only dinosaur reborn from extinction. Another dinosaur had reappeared. What had been an incredible and fun mystery had turned ominous. Two anomalies were impossible. Spino told me we shouldn't let it worry us just yet, to which I had reluctantly agreed, and so we just went back home, confused, but alive. Things didn't get any better for the next few months. Assessing the situation now, I can say that the fall of civilization occurred mostly over the winter months. The collapse more or less spreading eastward from the west coast, though I didn't truly see any of it happen living in the isolated area I was at the time. I remember one of the earliest things I did see on the wilder scale of things was a video that blew up on the internet after being uploaded. It showed a whale-watching ship called the Summer Air, full of eager tourists, suddenly be crushed and sunk when a Thalatorchon, a giant species of aquatic reptile that had been the dominant predator of the mid-Triassic era oceans, leapt from the water and down onto the boat. As horrible as it was, I couldn't help but think later on that it would have at least been a little ironic if it had been a Basilosaurus that had done the deed instead. Dark humor must have helped me with coping, especially in situations where you couldn't understand what the hell was happening. The coping activism at least helped me. Another video I saw around that time, shortly before winter, was a video someone had taken while out hiking in a national park. The video showed a pterodactyl flying over the people who were hiking, paying them no mind as it passed over them and continued flying on to wherever it was going. Though, of course, the video was very low quality and heavily pixelated, as videos like that always tend to be. You know what it was like at the time? It was like the Earth wanted humans gone and her prehistoric life back again. If I was the Earth, I can't say I wouldn't wish the same. This incident was one of the worst of those early months. It was around midnight when something within myself just made me wake up. Some sixth sense that picked up on that something was amiss. The house was dark. I never slept with the lights on. I'd never even done that as a kid, and I just had a feeling of danger being nearby. It was too quiet, even for a house in the middle of the night. I just knew that something was off. I left my bed and walked into the hall, hearing nothing but the sound of distant thunder. Occasional flashes of lightning through the windows were my only source of light. Wincing every time a floorboard creaked, I went down to the hall and entered the kitchen. Slowly, though, poking my head around the corner first before stepping in fully. Silence was almost overpowering. The sound of something moving made me stop. The center of my kitchen was the island countertop, and along with a flash of lightning, I saw that the kitchen window was busted and lay scattered on the floor. I still don't know how I didn't hear that, because I've never been a deep sleeper. And just poking out from the other side of the island was a mangled, bloodied, dead raccoon. I had only just seen it when it was suddenly, violently yanked back behind the counter, and I then heard chewing, bones snapping, and swallowing. Wide-eyed, I silently threw myself to the floor and ducked behind my side of the island. I heard something large stand up, still chewing, its claws taking the floor. I heard sniffing coming around my side of the island. I slid along the floor to stay on the opposite side of whatever the thing in my house was. The sniffing stopped, and I clearly heard it chittering softly. The sound is still as clear in my mind as it was on that night. Then there was just silence, until I heard the countertop creak as a massive weight was applied to it. The thing had climbed up onto the island, was likely scanning the room. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room and cast a shadow on the wall. It was apparent to me what the animal was. It was a Utah raptor. It had to be, because no other known raptor species was so large. I heard claws tapping the countertop as it sniffed the room. Risking a glance up, I saw it practically standing above me, one of its large toe claws inches above my head, slightly wrapped around the top of the counter. If it would have happened to glance down right then, it would have seen me. Not wanting to breathe, I pressed back against the island, trying to think of what my next move would be. I had no way to fight a Utah raptor. If you've never seen one, I envy you. But if you have, you know just how big they are. The only thing that I could do was try to get away and buy time until I thought of something. Well, it looked down before I could think of anything. It roared at me, and I scrambled to my feet, taking off down the hallway I'd come from. I remember I heard it land on the floor and begin to chase me. I knew I would not make it to my bedroom, so I ducked out of the hallway and into the living room, where I threw myself behind the couch. I then listened as the dinosaur ran in and stopped in the doorway. It began sniffing to try to find me. Hiding where I was wouldn't work. I didn't need it to. What I did need was for the dinosaur to leave the entrance way. Moved close. I took my chance and sprang past it, practically between its legs. I think it was startled. It was likely confused at my sudden movement, and it didn't chase me right away. In fact, I was back in the hallway and running towards my bedroom before I heard it shriek and begin to follow me again. Those few seconds were what saved me, because the raptor had just gotten back into the hallway as I slammed my bedroom door shut. It banged on the door, scratched at it a few times, and roared loudly, and then began to throw itself against the wood. I knew I only had a few seconds, so I went to the window and looked out. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house, so I didn't want to jump. As I was trying to decide what to do, the Utah raptor broke through my door and stalked inside the room, looking like the monster adults always promise their kids isn't under their beds. Even in the dark, I was able to see the outline of feathers, claws, and teeth. teeth just waiting inside my bedroom doorway. Not having a choice, I climbed out of the window and up onto the roof, feeling the wind created by the dinosaur's snapping jaws as it snapped by my feet. The rain made the siding slick, but I was able to reach the gutter and climb onto the roof with difficulty. Unfortunately, the raptor followed me. Jumping out of the window and latching onto the overhang as I had, it pulled itself up just as I rolled away from the edge. Soaked from the rain, I scampered across the roof and stood upright at the opposite end of the roof from the dinosaur. We were both soaked by the rain, and if anything, the raptor looked more frightening with wet feathers drooping along its body. With every flash of lightning, I caught a glimpse of the raptor's gleaming teeth and those large toe claws I'd heard tapping on the counter. The raptor began to climb towards me on all fours, using the claws on its hands and feet to grip the roof. "Oh, come on," I remember saying as I looked around. Spotting my pool, though it was a bit far, I knew it was the only place I could go. The pool was just inside of jumping distance if I backed up towards the raptor and sprinted before jumping, which is what I did. Somehow I avoided slipping and nearly ended up close enough to the raptor for it to swipe its claws at me. I landed in the pool on my back, causing a massive splash upon impact that knocked the wind out of myself. This stunned me for a moment, but I recovered after a short time and swam to the edge of the pool, where I climbed out quickly and then sprinted into the forest. I did not look back once. I just focused my attention on navigating through the forest and not on what was behind me. I found Spino quickly, woke him up, and told him what had just happened. He decided on the spot that from then on he'd be sleeping just outside my house and not in the forest. I spent that night cold and wet out in the forest, not getting another second of sleep. And first thing the following morning, Spino and I went back to my house. I watched from the tree line as he sniffed around my house until he finally told me that it was empty and the Utah raptor was gone. We decided that same morning it would be a good idea to search for the raptor. We searched for a full week, but we never found anything. The raptor had vanished like a ghost. Thankfully, that was the last big thing to happen for a while, so this section of my journal will be a record of journal events that occurred over a period of weeks. Simply ones that I feel are worth mentioning for one reason or another. While we were searching for the Utah raptor, we'd come across another dinosaur species, a baryonyx. It was milling around a small waterfall and natural pool. Spino and I stayed away, just observing it. The baryonyx had a partner, which came out of the trees and added some sticks to what looked like a tangled mess of brush on the ground with white rocks inside. It took me a second to realize that they were eggs. It was a mated pair, and they, and likely other dinosaurs as well, were reproducing. The implications of that were disconcerting. Summer turned to fall slowly as the months passed, and I kept up with the news about what had been happening. My university had long since put all classes on indefinite suspension, and the fall semester never even began. One day, as the leaves were just beginning to fall from the trees and form a blanket on the ground, I made a discovery with Spino while we were on our walk. It was a large skin that had been shed. Specifically, a large shed snake skin. It had to be a titanoboa skin. That was what made me first begin to look for things other than just dinosaurs roaming around. And it wasn't just carnivores roaming the earth again, despite what I'd personally seen. I'd seen videos of herbivores as well. I remember this one that went viral after being uploaded. It showed a triceratops attacking and pushing a semi off the road in the Mojave Desert somewhere. In the background, you could clearly see the cars swerving this way and that to avoid falling victim to the prehistoric power of the raging dinosaur. The weather was first beginning to turn cold when I was personally witness to another in-person show of prehistoric power. Spino was at my side, but not a player in this like he had been with the Tyrannosaur. We had been just sitting on a riverbank out in the forest as the sun had begun to drop low in the sky when a stegosaurus had sauntered into view on the opposite side of the bank from the left. It was just doing its thing, moseying on by without even a glance in our direction when something else stalked towards it from the right. A Ceratosaurus, or a horn nose, as Spino called it. They met and sized each other up for a moment before the carnivore had gone right for the Stegosaurus's neck. You always imagined what a fight between two dinosaurs might have been like, but actually seeing one from an impartial perspective, unlike with the Rex Spino had fought, was impossible to describe. It was just two primal forces going at it, indifferent to you while you observed. It was better than any painting or movie ever showed. I saw something that was practically mythical come to life. I've seen a lot of things that seem mythical come to life since this all started. The fight ended with the Stegosaurus stabbing the horn nose in the stomach several times with the spikes on its tail, which drove the Carnosaurus away. Though the Stegosaurus did die shortly after, having received too many injuries. I thought it had survived, but when Spino and I had walked past the spot the next day, we saw that it was dead on the riverbank. The body was untouched, so the Ceratosaurus never came back to feed on it, so it might have died too. I felt that this particular story deserved its own section instead of being lumped in with the rest. It was my encounter with a Tyrannosaurus that, though I never heard it speak, I knew it could talk. I remember that my mind had been wandering that morning. I was already able to tell that the world was about to change. It was as if the planet had decided to go back in time, millions of years. By the time this happened, winter had set in and snow was covering the ground in a white blanket. That particular day, I needed time alone. My breaking point had been when I heard one too many terrible stories on the radio. The big report was that a safe zone in Italy, set up right outside the ruins of Pompeii, had been destroyed. The nearby volcano had erupted. I don't remember the name of the mountain because I was never good at that stuff. The volcano had suddenly and violently erupted, and the authorities sent in a team to save anyone they could, but all they found was that the safe zone had been completely buried in ash. It turned out to be one tragic story too many for my taste, and I told Spino how I felt. I told him I was going for a walk to clear my head. He was hesitant after my earlier encounter. Yes, I was going alone despite the danger. Yes, I knew it was a stupid thing to do. Spino certainly wasn't thrilled when I told him that I was going for a short walk, but he agreed to let me go after a short argument. I don't remember how long I'd been walking through the snow-covered forest when it happened. It might have been around 10 minutes or so when I heard brush moving nearby. The sound caused me to stop. I turned and saw several black feathered raptors, large ones at that, stick their heads up out of the snow and gaze at me with hungry eyes. It was like some horrible movie jump scare come to life. They'd just been sitting there, buried underneath the snow, I guess. This part is a little bit of a fuzzy blur, but I remember turning and sprinting through the trees as fast as I was able in my restrictive winter clothes. I remember almost running or sliding into trees, narrowly missing them for several panicked moments. But then, I ran into something immovable. A leg. I fell back onto my butt and looked up to meet the eyes of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. It was the second one that I'd seen in person. It was brown in color, with gray feathers covering its body. It looked at me, growling softly, the same look in its eyes that Spino has, the same gleam of intelligence, higher thinking. That's how I knew it would talk. As its growling tapered off, then also rumbled deeply, its jaws now closed. I felt the sound vibrate through my body. The raptors, which had been chasing after me, must have felt the sound as well, because I heard them skidding through the snow to a collective stop behind me in what had to be sudden fear. Maybe they'd been just as oblivious to the presence of the silent T-Rex as I had been. Rex then glanced up at the raptors for a moment, and it turned its eyes back to me, hissed at them unexpectedly, and motioned for me to leave. It motioned in the exact direction of my home. How did it know where I lived? I didn't ask. I just got to my feet and ran. I didn't look back. I was too stunned and afraid to do anything but focus on getting home. Whatever the Rex did, it stopped the raptors from chasing me any further. I did make it home safely and told Spino what happened. Apparently that night, after I was asleep in bed, Spino went to the woods and found the Rex. They had a long talk. I don't know what about. Spino never has told me. The worst night of those early months was by far the night I had a run-in with another talking prehistoric animal. And this one ate me. Yeah, you read that right. And it was just as bad as you can imagine it was. Here's what went down. As I remember it, by this particular point, man didn't rule Earth anymore. I mean, areas such as Washington, D.C. were still more or less functioning as usual before the apocalypse. People were still doing their everyday jobs, but the further west you went across the continent, the worse things became. Being from Western Ohio, I was living in the middle area between normalcy and chaos. The internet was still working where I lived, and I recall all the wild theories about what had caused everything to go wrong in the world. The wrath of God was one idea thrown around. Others said that the universe itself was glitching. Alien invasion was, of course, another theory people were adamant about. And people also blamed the government and even the space agencies of all things for the collapse of the world as we knew it. The conspiracy theories hit an all-time high for absurdity during that time. I can't say for certain, though, because I stopped paying attention once people claimed that it was higher dimensional aliens causing our global predicament. It was still winter at that point, close to Christmas, or maybe it was January. It was so hard to keep track, but the snow still covered the ground, and I remember thinking it would never melt. I'd lost track of the dates because keeping them straight was not high on my list of priorities those days. The blanket of snow on the ground was much thinner at this point, which was nice since running would be easier should I have to do so again. Spino and I had decided to make the most of all the new things that were here to see and make the best of the cards that we'd been dealt. We'd often explore areas of the forest to see what new creatures we could find. In all honesty, it was a nice distraction. I knew things were falling apart at the seams, but living so far in the country meant that I was unaware that things were becoming worse in every major city as civilization became overwhelmed by all the new threats. People simply could not manage the change in society and the comforts they had become used to, and they packed up and left the cities. As they fled, the House of Cards began to collapse around them. At that time, for Spino and I, the only thing that had changed was an increase in threats. For part of our trip that day, I rode on Spino's back because we didn't know what to expect. After a long while, we encountered no animals at all, not even a stray deer, so Spino decided it would be safe if I walked alongside him. We continued our exploring and soon found ourselves standing on the top of a large hill. Far off in the valley below, we could see the remainder of a farm, obviously long abandoned. After some more walking, we arrived and looked around. We found nothing. I thought at that moment that no one had been there in at least 50 years. The place was extremely dilapidated, especially the barn, so it was probably more. Near the house, there was a rusted hulk of a 1940s truck that was little more than a frame at this point. Also, half buried in the snow were the remains of various bits of rusted equipment scattered around the yard. There was also a frozen stream nearby, probably where those who lived here long ago got their water. We followed alongside the stream, and it led to a frozen waterfall. It was there that I suddenly sensed a weird feeling as if someone watching us. Spino began to look around at the forest, which appeared void of any living thing. So I reached over and tapped his leg. "You feel it too?" I asked him. He nodded. His gaze didn't leave the surrounding trees. The only movement either of us saw was snow silently falling from the branches. We both quickly decided to walk back towards the barn. That eerie sensation never left us. We went back up the hill and followed Spino's tracks back to our house, leaving the old farm behind. As I recall, evening was close by the time we returned to our home. I said goodnight to Spino, and after eating a meal of flavorless noodles from a can, I went to bed. I woke later that night because something felt off. Sort of a deja vu moment. It was like the feeling I'd had the night the raptor was in the house. What I am about to share still makes me shudder when I think about it. My body fully awoke. I realized I wasn't in my bed anymore. I was next to it, lying on the floor, wrapped in the coils of a gigantic snake. I still have nightmares about it. Before I could scream, the snake tightened its coils around my body to stop my voice from escaping. "No, no, no. None of that," it hissed at me. The voice sounded like a mix between male and female, and it was odd sounding. It was hard falling in the cold, and harder still to sneak in here without your giant watchdog seeing me. But I did, and here is my prize. It then hissed into my ear. "Let me go." I was able to speak out. "Once he realizes what's going on, he'll crash through the wall to get you," I told it, straining to breathe. My hand is shaking as I remember the next part of the story. "Yes, but it will be too late to save you. Don't worry. I won't crush you with my coils. I like my prey to be alive and wriggling. When it hits my stomach," Titanoboa hissed to me. His voice, so sadistic and excited, it created cold fear inside of me. So cold and scary that I still feel the same today when I remember it. I want to emphasize that this is getting very hard to write. This is not a memory I enjoy reliving. "No, not that," I begged the snake. "Oh yes, that," that's all it said in response, before opening its maw as wide as it would go. I heard its jaw snap as it unhinged and felt a blast of scorching heat strike me. With delicate movements, clearly developed by past experiences, the gigantic snake pushed my head inside its jaws using its coil like I would my hands, past its thin, pointed teeth, and then moved its jaws behind my head. I can still feel the pinch and pull of its teeth all along my body. It was painful. The snake began pushing me deeper into its throat. It was slow. Dear God, it was so slow.
The snake paused after every swallow, and I couldn't fight back at all. The coils, the teeth, the snake's body held my arms and legs tightly. All I could do was lay there and let this horrible thing happen. It was frightening and maddening. I hope that no one else ever experiences that kind of paralyzing fear. Despite the deliberately slow actions of the Titanoboa, all too soon I was completely inside its throat. I was able to hear the muffled sound of its jaw rehinging as I slowly moved down into its thin body to the place of no return. Obviously, this snake had been able to talk, but it didn't seem to want anything from me other than to get a fresh meal. I passed out before I got to the snake's stomach, and, I really thought that was the end of me. But since I'm writing this now, you know I didn't die. I awoke after what had to just be minutes to a violent shaking as the snake was thrashed and thrown. Suddenly, a claw tore through the snake's flesh next to my head, almost cutting me open in the process. Something then seized me and pulled me out of the snake's gut. Spino lifted me out. He seemed frightened. The snake was going for the woods, he told me as he hugged me to his chest. He didn't say anything else. He just hugged me. After a moment, I returned the hug, very, very happy to be alive. Thank you, I told him. My body was shaking, but I was able to keep my voice steady as I spoke. I noticed that the sun was rising as I spoke, meaning the snake had waited most of the night before it made its move to attack me, and the early dawn light filled the woods with glorious colors. I have never seen a more beautiful sunrise since. How did it get in? I asked Spino once I stopped shaking from fright, though I then began shaking from the cold. Even though I'd calmed down, part of me hoped that Spino would never let me out of his embrace, ever. The snake found a way to open the door, Spino said to me, his breath visible in the chilly air. That news was terrific to learn. If these things, the talking creatures, could figure out how to open doors, then I knew I'd have more problems in the future. It was obvious that Spino, and the Rex that saved me, were not just flukes in this new world. How widespread would the phenomena of talking, intelligent creatures be compared to the rest throughout the anomaly that was continuously spreading like a virus across the country? I'll end this section with a closing mystery, one that the snake's own words made me think about. Winter had been set in for months, and snow and ice were in abundance. I don't understand how the Titanoboa had survived in such a cold environment. My only guess is that since the snake was one of the rare talking, reborn prehistoric animals, then it was obviously not an average Titanoboa, and it likely had other secrets up its scales. The same principle goes for Spino, since he has no eel-like tail, which Spinosaurus is known to have had. And in all the videos that I'd seen of other Spinosaurus, mostly from places like the Everglades, they all had that tail. And all the ones in those internet videos were not talking ones. Throughout the rest of that winter, Spino and I continued to explore. Despite the encounter with the Titanoboa, we felt we still needed to know what other threats might lie outside of our small part of the world. This part of our story tends to blend together, so I'll just condense how things played out until spring came. We found camps with people living together hidden away in the forest, but we never made contact. The power to my house flickered more frequently as the months passed, and finally went out for good near the end of winter. I imagine people stopped going to work at the power plants and the grids finally collapsed. According to the battery-powered radio I had at the time, things were still more or less normal in Washington, D.C. The president made daily announcements as the rest of the world rapidly collapsed.
The president said the government was focusing on a research project with the CDC to try to create a virus that would wipe out the dinosaurs and all other re-emerged prehistoric animals. But everything they had tried up to that point was just as lethal to humans as it was to dinosaurs. Developing a virus that is lethal to animals from both the Jurassic and Silurian eras, as well as all other time periods, up to the present, is complicated biology, to put it mildly. The virus would have to be lethal to only those animals from prehistoric eras and not lethal to humans or modern animals. This would have been a daunting task for those assigned to the project, and I'm afraid simply impractical as well. My belief is that the virus plan grew out of desperation and not strong science. At least, here, the government didn't take violent measures to try and control what was happening. Other countries with more controlling governments had taken to bombing their own land to purge the threat, their citizens be damned. This horrifying self-destruction took place in countries considered stable and not in some type of conflict already. Countries with ongoing civil wars prior to this event had fallen into even more chaos than they were in before the anomaly. I felt so sad for the people in those places, and I hope most found a way to escape safely. In turn, people who were living in tiny villages or on small isolated islands in, say, the Pacific Ocean were most likely still going about their day-to-day lives without really noticing much of a change. Around this time, I also heard rumors about something weird going on somewhere in Europe, but I never learned anything concrete about that. When the broadcasts from the president finally came to a halt, I believe Washington, D.C. had finally fallen and was no longer able to even try and keep things under control here in the United States. Though I feel security would have taken the president and tucked him in a bunker somewhere by then, so he could provide guidance and control once more when the world came back to normal. I don't see that ever happening, so who knows where he is now. The Tyrannosaurus that saved me from the raptor pack still made occasional appearances around my home, but I never heard him speak. Like I said before, I knew it could speak because I saw that spark of intelligence in his eyes whenever I caught a glimpse of him. It was around this time that I began to see various species of dinosaurs and other prehistoric life much more often. These included various species, some of which I couldn't identify. That Baryonyx family had also grown. The last time I saw them, there were at least a dozen rather cute babies added to the herd. Finally, after spring finally arrived and the trees had all turned green again, I told Spino that the area was becoming simply too dangerous, and we needed to leave. He didn't protest. He'd been more on edge than ever after the Titanoboa incident from months before. I packed 2 bags. I left a note on the island counter explaining the area was too dangerous to stay in and warned anyone who found the note that they needed to leave as soon as possible. I also left a mention about what direction we had walked in just in case any extended family decided to try and come find me. The least I could do was let them know I was alive. I had cut off all contact with everyone but a cousin from Alabama when I went to college. There was a chance they had survived when things turned bad and might have tried to locate me. I still don't know if they survived the initial collapse, but I hope they did. This wasn't like an apocalyptic movie where a virus wiped out 99% of the population. In our new world, most of the world's population had survived. People scattered from the cities and into the countryside or onto boats on the ocean when things got bad. The majority of those who died when things fell apart probably did so in the cities, during the chaos of the collapse as people fought one another for supplies. At least that's the image I gathered from what was happening around here in the US. It might have played out completely differently in other countries, I have no way of knowing. Just before I left my house for the last time with Spino, we had a surprise visitor. It was the Tyrannosaurus Rex who saved me from the raptors. He didn't speak. He just stood in the tree line and looked at us. After a while, he nodded his head at me in such a way that I understood meant to be a goodbye and a wish for good luck. When we came to the first highway, I honestly wasn't sure what to expect. Roaming groups of people had to be everywhere, and these expansive roads would likely be one of their top choices for travel. When we came to the highway, a large divided one with 4 lanes, it was empty, save for abandoned cars scattered all around. Surrounding us were tall, forested hills and doubtless unseen threats. I
I think that seeing the abandoned cars everywhere brought on the true realization that that the civilized world really had ended or was on the cusp of totally falling apart. It hit me like a truck that had been flung off the road by a triceratops. I was emerging from roughly half a year in isolation to a whole new world. Reading about the collapse online and hearing about it on the radio still had a feeling of disconnect from it all. Seeing it with my own eyes is what made it real. Our trek down the highway, which wound through forests and hills and occasionally past silent towns, lasted for several uneventful days. I thought that maybe if I could find a police car, I could use the radio to figure out where people might have been, but I never could find one. Spino was able to find food for us easily enough, and I'd packed enough water to last about 100 miles if I was careful with the amount I drank. Other than that, I didn't pack much. There was some clothes, some basic medical supplies, a small first aid kit, a small tent and sleeping bag, some other odds and ends, and a few of my favorite books. I also made room to pack the stuffed Dilophosaurus that I'd had since I was a kid. It's my equivalent to a teddy bear, and I couldn't just leave it behind. And so, I packed it. Leaving everything else behind forever had been much harder than I thought it would be. You know that before the collapse, scientists were trying to clone a woolly mammoth, right? Well, let me tell you quickly about the time that I first saw a mammoth with my own eyes. It was while I was on the road with Spino. Who would have thought that scientists didn't have to bring the mammoth back, but only had to wait for the universe to do it for them? We made camp off the side of the road, and I'd gotten a nice fire going before it came dark. At that point, I still wasn't used to just how silent and still the world was. Cars, planes, or other human-caused noises. You have no idea how much those noises of all of our machines and technology make until they are just taken away. I often became lost in thought while thinking about it, what was happening to everyone on the planet, and would just end up staring into the fire for hours on end, just like this particular night. To me, it seemed that my fire was the only light left shining on Earth. "Are you okay?" Spino asked me after a while. I'm I'm just I don't know. Not doing well with everything," I replied, looking at him. "Everyone I know is probably dead. Everything I know is gone. Is there even any point of going on?" Seeing the world abandoned through my own eyes had been harder to take than I'd expected. Hearing about it happening through the grapevine using only my ears and my imagination made it seem less real. It was when the protection of my home was gone that I finally had to face the ugly reality of what the world had become. And facing that reality was tough enough that it caused me to have a serious spike in depression in that moment of clarity. "There's always a reason," Spino said in return. "Maybe you just don't know what it is yet." "Maybe," I replied, nodding slightly. A distant roar sounded in the night, and both of us looked in the direction it seemed to come. "You're not alone. At the very least, I'm still here with you," Spino told me, still looking in the direction the roar had come from. "Thanks, buddy," I said. The truth was, Spino did make me feel better. He was my constant guardian angel on those desolate roads, forests, and anywhere else that I needed him. His caring presence was enough for me to shed off that depressive state. It was as I was thinking about this when I saw something cross the empty highway in the distance. Spino and I were witness to the sight of an actual woolly mammoth crossing the road. We watched it exit the trees on the right, cross the road until it vanished on the left, trumpeting one time as it moved on. I was entranced. I think most people would have been if they got to see what their ancestors thousands of years ago saw. It was like seeing something else mythical, something you should never have been able to actually see, the flesh.
After following the road for several uneventful days, I recall sitting alongside of the road, resting during a hot afternoon, when I heard a truck engine. This was the first artificial sound I had heard since I left my house. The truck stopped a short distance down the road from where we were, and we could see people begin to set up tents. I crept closer, with Spino right behind me. He was practically crawling on his stomach, pressed tightly down on the ground to keep as low as possible. It was somewhat comical looking, honestly. From where we lay, hidden among the weeds, we heard people from the truck talking to a young woman. She was thanking them for saving her. After I listened in on their conversation for a while, I decided that they seemed like good people. I told Spino not to come out until I said, then I walked out and asked loudly if there was an open invitation to be saved by the group. I remember how much they jumped at my appearance and how the act made them appear to be suddenly very on edge. They seemed a little too on edge. I introduced myself and told them I hadn't seen anyone new in nearly a year, and we talked about whether I could go with them or not. After prodding me with questions until they seemed satisfied with my answers, they said I had to pull my weight if I joined them. I grinned at that statement, and I said to them that my buddy could pull more than our weight combined. All of our weight combined, actually. They chuckled at this and asked who my buddy was. After telling them not to freak out, I turned and called, "Come out!" Spino slowly came out of the trees, and there was a collective gasp, and they raised their guns, taking aim. "I told you not to freak out!" I laughed, and then explained that Spino was my friend. They were quite nervous, but lowered their guns. I still chuckle at that memory whenever I think about it. "How?" one of them finally managed to say. Then I told them about how I found the egg and raised the baby that hatched from it. They were still doubtful about Spino, but agreed that we could go back to their community with them. A whole community? I found that exciting. I hadn't seen a functioning community since before society's fall. They continued to be on edge for Spino for a few hours afterwards, but I think they warmed up to him just a little more when he brought back an entire deer for us to share for supper. After we ate and talked a while longer, they explained that they were scouts for their community, and their job was to locate other survivors. They also told me that they were having an ongoing conflict with another group, who seemingly forced dinosaurs into submission and then used them by riding them into battle. They told me that this dinosaur riding group were really bad people, which was why they were so jumpy when I appeared. They then added that they also were trying to kill all of them, but neither side had gotten an advantage over the other in the months that the conflict had dragged on. They'd been sent out a few days prior to our meeting by their community's leader to scavenge for supplies and find any other people who were not affiliated with their enemy and who needed a home. It was a job they'd been doing for months by that time, and they had been doing it over again every few weeks like clockwork. So, now that we've covered up to my basic introduction to the community I still call home today, this next part of my story is how I found myself in the middle of a war to save it. It seems that even when the world falls apart around us, humans can still not find a way to work together and get along. I guess some things never change. And I find it amazing that humans ever got as far along as we did building our civilizations throughout our collective history with this in mind. Before describing my part in the war, I'm going to describe what the community is like, or was like at the time of my arrival. Before the world ended, the place had been a housing development. Newly constructed one, in fact. So recently built before things fell apart that none of the houses had been lived in yet. That meant nice new houses, newly paved streets, lots of room, a park-like area at the center of the community, and even basic self-sustaining systems. They still had running water and basic electricity thanks to solar panels on each house. But keeping the running water system working properly did end up becoming an issue, and we had to shut the system off after about a year. Until we can find a natural spring to tap into and run that water through a reworked pipe system, we're out of running water. But we have wells to draw water from, so it's not a huge issue, just an inconvenience. I quickly learned that their town existed due to pure luck. When civilization was busting at the seams and on the fringe of falling apart completely, many people fled out of the cities and moved into the country, as I had deduced early on.
Just before winter, during that time in autumn that the weather gets cold and stays that way, several groups of people came to the town because they knew that its construction had just been completed, partially due to signs advertising this fact out on the highways. They simply used the leftover building materials from the construction to build a wall that surrounded the community. The wall was a giant, roughly square shaped barrier around the community, about as tall as Spino, which allowed the community to remain as it was while the world outside broke down and fell into unprecedented. However, the community members quickly found out that there was a trade off for living in this place. As the area the community had been built in was very heavily forested on all sides, it was easy for others to sneak close to the wall without being seen. In some areas, the trees grew right up against the wall. This lack of visibility was later cited by community members as a reason that the previously mentioned hostile group had been able to catch everyone unawares, even with guards posted on the walls. Trees were simply too densely packed to see anyone approaching. However, cutting down enough trees to remedy that issue was considered unworthy of the limited resources such an action would take. Now that you better understand the community situation, I'm going to get back to my part of the story. This chance felt like a time to begin once more. When Spino and I arrived outside of the gate, those who found us took out a walkie-talkie and explained to someone on the other side that they had three newcomers and not to worry because the dinosaur was with them and was tame and could talk. At this point, I could see the wall. Outwardly, it was covered in sheets of various metals. These sheets of mostly steel covered the original wooden wall that had been constructed, and it had been put up to further increase defensive ability. Out of all the walls that surround the community, the wall in front of us was the only one with a gate. When the gate was pulled open for us, I saw it slide open on a track instead of swinging as I had thought it would. Once we were inside, I noticed a series of walkways along the perimeter that guards would walk along to keep watch, accessible by ladders. We made our way further inside. Spino drew a bit of a crowd of onlookers. Back then, talking animals were still an alien concept for most, but he was quickly explained to everyone. Most people still kept their distance, though. I remember what happened next clearly, so I can describe it in great detail. A young African American man stepped out of the crowd. He was around the same age as me and walked right up to me, looked me in the eyes, and shook my hand and introduced himself. "Hi, name's Mark," he said, slight accent to his voice. This was a man who would not only become a friend, but who I would come to view as the brother I never had. Mark was a man with kind eyes, slightly muscular build, and a protruding bottom jaw forming an underbite. Being polite, I shook his head in return and smiled. "It's nice to meet you. I always come to meet the new people. Those same scouts found me out on the road. I'd been on the road for a while by the time they found me. I came from this big ranch house in Montana. I grew up there, but I left back in January and was trying to get to Washington," Mark explained. I remember saying, "Wow, you came from a long way," my eyebrows raising in surprise. "Yeah, it was a long trip. I went east until I hit Lake Michigan. Then I swung southeast until I came to the Indiana Dunes Lakeshore, just outside of Chesterton, Indiana. Beautiful place where I thought about just staying, since there was a colony of people already there. After I left there, I headed south for a while, then I headed east again just north of Indianapolis. Lots of bad people out there, and a lot of dangerous animals too. Then I made it, and this place has been so nice that I'm happy I didn't reach Washington." "Where'd you come from?" he asked. I shrugged. "Nowhere special, just down the road away, I guess." As I was speaking, a Caucasian man wearing a light tan jacket pushed through the crowd. He was older than me, in his 70s, I later learned. He was paler than me, too. Had a gruff demeanor, had wrinkles and white hair, and an aura of authoritative control. And while he was trying to be polite, I could tell I wasn't going to like him. I could tell that the moment I saw this guy, that he was an ass. He introduced himself as Wheatley and then said, "I'm the man in charge of this community, and the one who okayed your large friend. But if there is any problem with him, you're both out. You understand me, sport?" Yeah,
And it's Nick, not Sport, I said to him. Wheatley chuckled. Okay, Tiger. Then he went to introduce himself to the new girl who was in our group. I think her name was Sarah. I didn't know her long, so I don't remember for sure. Wheatley then showed us to our new homes. We stopped at mine first. It was a nice place, one that I would never have been able to afford in the old world. Before I went inside, I walked around the back of the house. The backyard was more than large enough for Spino to sleep and stretch out in comfortably. After making that determination, I stepped inside the back door, set my bag down on the kitchen table, and on the table lay a newspaper from a few months back. The front page story was about living dinosaurs being found. I found this a little humorous, but decided to explore the house instead of reading it. Our home was on a more isolated street in town, within sight of the gate, and both houses on either side of us were empty. I was alright with that. I think Spino was too, and I think they did it so Spino would be separated from everyone else. Spino didn't really like the place. He felt boxed in compared to the freedom he'd had all his life prior, so I tried to comfort him by telling him that he'd get used to us. It was our home now, after all. That night, I ate supper while sitting in my new living room. I had been told that Spino would just have to tell the gate guards when he wanted to go hunting or leave the community for any reason, and they'd let him out and back in upon his return. While I was eating, he was snoozing out in the backyard without having gone and eaten anything at all. I think he just wanted to stay close to me in case this place was some kind of giant setup. The way Spino looked at Wheatley revealed that he didn't trust him or like him at all. I don't think Wheatley was all that bad of a guy, but felt he was a controlling man with little regard for others. I felt that Wheatley did appreciate having such an asset as Spino in his community, though. Spino thought we'd be better off if he simply ate Wheatley and put an end to the whole irritation. But Spino knew better than to try it. I told him that in exchange for a safe place to live, he could put up with a little irritation from the guy in charge. My first evening was nice. It was heavenly, not having to look over my shoulder to make sure we weren't being trailed. Being eaten alive in my own home had made me a little paranoid, so the change was welcome. I remember being surprised when there was a knock at the door. I'd finished eating and was washing my plate. I dried my hands and went to the door, and Mark was standing there. Thought I'd come by, get to know you a little bit. Okay, come in, I replied to him, smiling. He came inside, and I shut the door behind him. Mark sat down on the leather couch, and I took the matching recliner. After offering him a drink, which he refused, we made inquisitive chit-chat. As we talked, I realized that Mark didn't seem to be the quickest person at picking up certain social cues. He often spoke in long, unbroken monologues without pausing. I quickly learned, also, that he was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, and I found it hard at times to get a word in. However, I also learned that he had a heart of pure gold, as a very hopeful outlook on everything. So I greatly enjoyed his company and the stories he told me about his family and his life in Montana. He was just as interested in my time raising Spino. Some of our conversation went like this. So, where do you come from exactly? He asked me. I could tell he wanted specifics this time, so I told him about my old house, how I'd raised Spino there, and that I had walked all the way here with Spino, probably less than 50 miles. I asked Mark about himself, and he said he'd wanted to join the military back in his teens, but the recruiter had told him to leave, saying something about his poor vision being a danger to everyone. His mother had been heartbroken by this. My vision's not the best, he admitted to me, tapping his glasses. But I see just fine with these. I think that officer was just... He trailed off, so I offered up a suggestion. An ass? I said, finishing the sentence with an understanding look. Mark smiled and chuckled. That works, he nodded in an approving manner. I am a terrific shot, and could have been the best sniper the U.S. military ever saw for all that guy knew. But instead, I committed myself to taking care of the family ranch, which has been passed down from father to child since the Civil War. My granddaddy's granddaddy fought in that war, helped storm a Confederate fort on some beach even. Family story is that he shot some Confederate general and then threw him over the wall. There's a picture of him back at the ranch. He was a big man, so it might be true. I hope that I can go back to that ranch one day. The whole family is buried there, and I want to be too, if possible. We talked for several more minutes until Mark said he had to leave. It was getting late, and he rose early in the mornings. I wished him a good night, and after he left, I went out to the backyard. Spino playfully pounced on me from the side as soon as I was out the door, pinning me down under one of his large hands, and he said, "Just because we're somewhere new doesn't mean old games are going to stop." Let me up, and I groaned. Being pinned, even relatively gently, by a Spinosaurus doesn't feel good. Remember that if you ever befriend one. They play roughly. I told him that I was fine with that, though he needed to remember he wasn't exactly small anymore. He seemed happy to hear that I was okay with old games continuing as they used to, though I don't think my advisory statement made any difference. I was just pleased that he seemed to be warming up to the community. He laid down in the yard, and I joined him. Instead of sleeping in my new bed on my first night, I spent it snuggled with my giant best friend, safe as could be. That first day was nice. It really was. As I pointed out, I didn't have to continuously look over my shoulder, and I could relax for the first time in months. Do you appreciate how much stress builds up in that amount of time? Finally letting it release was heavenly. That all came to an end on the second day. That was the day I realized just how bad the conflict really was. The morning had begun well. I took a shower and shaved for the first time in almost a year. When I went outside, Wheatley was walking up to the door. My bliss came to an end pretty much right away from there. "Oh, good morning," he said with a smile that made me suspicious. "Want to come in? I just started coffee," I offered him. "That would be great. Thank you." I poured 2 cups. He requested no sugar in his. Then I waited for what he had to say. It didn't take long. He spilled the beans right away. "I'm sure you've heard about our little issue with the group we call the Dinosaur Riders, though most people simply refer to them as Dino Riders for short. It is just a nickname, mind you. We don't know what they call themselves. They're bandits, marauders, murderers. My guess is that they're all the kind of people who were just waiting for a world without government-enforced laws and regulations to hold them back from their true desires. You and your giant friend are joining the fight against them. Consider it the price of admission." He then took a sip from his drink and waited for my reply. I couldn't argue, and just told him to go on and listen to what he had to say. As it turned out, the Dino Riders were a group who had shown up seemingly from out of nowhere, riding Utah raptors with slightly altered horse saddles. Those raptors they rode were smart dinosaurs, so the community's best guess was that they had been trained like people who trained horses or dogs for combat. Some of the raptors could be the talking kind for all we knew. The riders themselves were a deviously clever bunch, often coming up with new ways of carrying out attacks. They also seemed like they were nothing more than traveling raiders that just hit any community or group they happened to find. With the number of riders in the group and how well stocked they were, Wheatley knew that there had to be a camp or other base of operations set up nearby. They must have been stocked from earlier successful attacks and raids on other groups. Turns out this prediction was correct. That very morning, some of the community's scouts found the Dino Riders' camp in a large field not far from the town. An attack was going to be carried out against the Riders later that day. My first day in the conflict played out like this. I was given a gun, and 2 hours later, riding on Spino's back, we left with nearly half the community. They were all in trucks or cars, and after a while of creeping along empty roadways, we stopped. Everyone left the vehicles and moved to a hill just off the road.
mission was simple. Get to a high point above the Dino Riders' camp and attack. We wanted to put an end to the fighting. I learned that this conflict had been ongoing since the middle of winter. I knew it had been going on for months, but I didn't realize it had been that extensive. Also, most of the survivors in the community were not experienced or trained and had been forced to learn as they fought. Combine their lack of training with the new snow that had fallen over the winter, and it had been a very brutal few months for everyone involved. From what I was told, the populace of the community was much smaller when I joined than it had been. When we made our way to our point of attack, I considered what was about to happen. I never thought that I'd be forced to point a gun at someone with the intention to kill. I was trying to mentally prepare myself to pull that trigger, to murder someone, not to kill. When we neared our destination, Spino dropped down onto his belly so I could slide off his neck and join the rest of the makeshift militia. We all crouched, walked, or crawled toward the top of the hill that we would use to ambush our enemies. Spino stayed back so he could not be seen. He was a wild card we could play if things got messy. We all went to the top of the hill and crouched down, just off the side of the road, and hit the signal to attack. Just as we were about to stand up and start firing, several strangers jumped out in front of the tall grass in front of us and stabbed several of our people with spears. We opened fire on them, shooting several people as they emerged from the tall grass. I froze, just like that time I'd first encountered a tyrannosaur, when the skirmish began and didn't shoot once. By the time those who'd ambushed us were lying dead on the ground, the riders down in the camp had jumped up onto the backs of their raptors and began riding up the hill towards us, screaming war cries. After everything I'd been told, I thought their numbers seemed rather small, but I couldn't focus on that at the moment. They had guns too, and overall, they seemed rather well-stocked, so I believed Wheatley's guess that they had raided and stolen from other smaller groups of survivors. I also would bet that they fed their victims to their dinosaurs. They had to have some way of controlling those massive Utah raptors after all. I cannot be certain that this assumption is correct, but it was probable. It seems impossible they could easily feed a whole cavalry of Utah raptors without resorting to some mass production of meat. People are resourceful, and the Dino Riders clearly had found a way to deal with the issue of feeding their steeds. The raptors were coming at us in a fast blur of claws and feathers, and we moved back down toward the cars for cover. Some of the riders with bows began shooting flaming arrows at us as we backed off. Others were using what were clearly poisoned arrows, while others were also firing normal, unaltered ones at us. It didn't really matter what type of arrow they used, though. Each one could kill you. I knew that once the riders with guns got to the top of the hill, the place would become a shooting gallery. It was at this time that I raised my weapon with shaking hands. This time, I'd mentally prepped myself enough that I knew I could shoot to kill. The riders only stopped their charge once they reached the top of the hill. It was at this time that Spino revealed himself and roared. Terrified at the sudden appearance of a giant carnivore, the riders scampered in all directions. Seeing them scatter was a great relief. If Spino hadn't been there, most of us, if not all of us, probably would have been killed. The Dino Riders had clearly been ready for us, so they must have known we were coming. Maybe their own scouts had seen us? It didn't matter. That day, we were saved by our Spinosaurus friend. But damn, the riders were slippery. While we were tending to the wounded, our handheld radios broke out in a mix of voices and static. We quickly picked up on what was being said, and it was the worst thing we could have heard. The Dino Riders were attacking our home, and most of the community's fighting force was outside of our walls. It turned out, several riders had climbed up the walls like actual monkeys, overpowered the guards on the wall, and pulled the gate open just enough for the Utah raptors to start slipping inside. The other riders outside then appeared from the forest, pulled the gate open fully, and attacked. It was the first time they'd gotten inside of the walls of the community. Whenever we heard about it, an intense firefight had already broken out on the main street. I just didn't understand how they'd reached the community so quickly. Utah raptors were fast, but not that fast. But I learned. We all learned. My observation of there being so few of them during our attack had been an omen. They'd been 2 steps ahead of us from the start. We got home quickly and found several houses ablaze and a full-on war raging throughout the town.
The most intense fighting was in the area around the gate. Suddenly, the riders from the camp reappeared behind us. They had divided their numbers from the beginning, with the bulk of their forces waiting to attack the community while we were gone. As we returned to our home, over 100 more dino riders charged in from behind us, cutting us off from any escape and trapping us all inside. "Shit! There's more than we thought!" a voice shouted through the radio I was wearing on my waist. I found out later that this was the first time the community had seen the dino riders full force, because they often attack with small groups or deadly ambushes that left no survivors. It seemed that their patience had run out and they decided to attack in full force while our numbers were divided. The ones at the camp hadn't put up a fight at all because they were just a distraction. Spino was our saving grace once again. Even with their numbers, the dino riders, even their raptors, couldn't fight off a massive, oversized Spinosaurus. Throughout the battle, I shot several riders and their dinosaurs. This was an action that only really hit me emotionally once it was over. But the only one of us who really made a difference by the end of it all was Spino. That day, he got his claws very bloody, killing at least 40 dino riders on his own. His claws, stepping on them, biting them, and throwing them. He saved us that day. He was enough to finally make the dino riders flee the battle and retreat into the forest. It had been hours of hard fighting, but we'd driven them out. Our dead were many, including Sarah, Wheatley, and dozens more. But we'd saved our home, for the time being. Spino had been an overwhelming opponent, and because of him, their casualties had been higher than ours. The dino riders still outnumbered us, especially if you counted both rider and dinosaur separately. That realization was a daunting one. The only solace was that we had a primal force like Spino on our side, and that we seemed to have better weapons overall than the riders did. Following the battle, we hoped that we would have some time before the next attack to recover and prepare. But it would come that night, and it would be even worse. I ended my last entry without explaining the aftermath of the attack, so I'll dive into that and supply some details about it before covering the next attack the Dino Riders carried out against us. We were able to extinguish the fire started during the battle, but many of the buildings were severely damaged, especially the ones in the vicinity of the gate and around the protective walls. Some could be repaired, but new ones were going to be needed built in. My thoughts throughout that afternoon were on the battle, and I saw images rushing through my head that scared me, things I tried to push away each time. The moment of reflection, the thought came to me of just how easy it had been to turn a gun on another human being. The first man I shot was one who jumped from his raptor and sprinted at me with some kind of handheld weapon. I didn't think about it. I just pulled the trigger and kept firing until he was on the ground. I killed the person, but had not really thought about how easy it had been. When I realized later that it had been so easy, I became really scared. This new world changes you quicker than you realize. What it changed me into was something I did not want to consume. The side of me that still exists, and it scares me, but I have never let it dominate me. Still, throughout the battle, it had been so frighteningly easy to take another's life. In the apocalypse setting, killing is an inevitability. Not allowing that ease to kill to take over your whole being is the hard part, because if you do allow it, it will change you forever. It will take you to a dark place, and that's somewhere that I never want to go. I had to tell myself that you could still be a good person, even if you had to do bad things at times. For those of you sharing this world with me, you will eventually have to get blood on your hands, if you haven't already. Don't let it define you. You can stay a good person, even when you must do the worst things imaginable just to stay alive. Just remember that. Your actions don't define you if you don't let them. During a more placid moment of that afternoon, I decided to have a seat on a bench near my house. It had remained undamaged during the invasion of the riders, I willingly relinquished it for community use due to the number of damaged buildings, and it was being used to house several wounded people temporarily. The community ended up needing it for several weeks because my house ended up being used to hold people who had suffered burns from the fires. As I sat on the bench, I was joined by Mark, who had also survived the attack. He began chatting with me, just like the night before. "You know what I'm gonna do when this is all over?" Mark asked me, having picked up right where he'd left off last night. "What's that?" I responded. "There's this empty lot down at the end of this street. I'm going to build me a little cabin, a little one-room cabin. Something that feels like home. I always wanted one on our land back in Montana. My daddy said that we'd build one, but we never got around to it," he told me, and then continued to describe his exact vision to me down to the last nail. I remember his words and voice as if he'd just told me this yesterday. "I tell you what," I said to him, "this is over. I'll help you build it." Mark seemed very happy with this news, and he said, "You are the nicest person in this town. Wheatley was never nice to nobody. You're different. Can I call you a friend?" I smiled at that, which turned into a laugh after a few seconds. "Damn right you can," spoke. He then put a hand on my shoulder. "Nick, my good friend," he replied. By the time the sun set, people were trying to fix the gate, but were met with little success. So it was stuck open and would remain so until a few replacement parts could be found. After watching them try to clear away the mess for a while, I found that I needed to just not see it for a while. I needed to get away from the mess and decided to take a few minutes away from everyone and walk with Spino to an unpopulated part of the town. Most of the buildings on that street had been burned to varying extents, but thankfully they were all uninhabited, and thus empty of people. Spino sat down in one of the yards, and I just enjoyed a chance to be alone with him after the horror show of the day. I could fancy a wink or two," I said to him, putting my gun down on the sidewalk. Spino gave me a gentle nudge with his snout, followed by a giant lick as I sat down next to him before he laid his head down, which I leaned against. I was as restless and tense as I was tired, but gazing into his affection-filled red eye until I fell asleep helped me feel calm and reassured. Honestly, I do not know how long I slept. I hadn't intended to fall asleep in the first place, but I had just been so sore and tired that it had ended up happening. Put it lightly, it had been a bad day. Spino was more worried for me than he was about the town, which is why he didn't stop me from falling asleep. Cheeky dinosaur. When I woke up, it was dark out. It must have been sometime in the middle of the night. The sounds of popping, crashing, shrieking, and screaming from the gate had woke me. The gate was a few streets over from where we were sleeping. Spino then looked down at me and simply said, "They're back." There was already a tense firefight going on when we arrived back to the main area of the town, and I got to experience the ugly horror of war all over again. I tell you, that stuff leaves deep wounds that never heal. Not fully. I was witness to several people from the community getting jumped on, pinned under, and mauled by the large raptors the Dinos riders used as steeds. War cries and gunshots sounded from everywhere, along with roars from the riders' Utah raptors. The occasional explosion, which left several more buildings on fire. Stray bullets flew over my head before I reached the street where the main battle was happening. I scanned the battlefield once I arrived. The street was illuminated by the red glow from burning buildings, and I saw Mark struggling with someone who had a knife and was straddling him. "Mark!" I shouted, adding my voice to the cacophony filling the night. I raised my gun, but Spino got the guy instead. Swinging his clawed hand down, he sent the dino rider attacking Mark flying into a burning building. I watched the rider crash through the charred roof and fall inside, where the flames consumed him like a baryonyx consumes fish. I hurried to Mark's side and helped him to his feet. "Are you okay?" I asked him.
He nodded, adjusting his glasses. Thank you, both of you. As we joined the fight, I noticed several folks from the community dove into some of the ditches along the side of the road and were using them as cover as they shot at both attacking humans and dinosaurs from a place of relative safety. There must also have been some dino riders outside because a constant barrage of flaming arrows was raining down on us and our buildings from the other side of the wall. Occasionally, a flaming bundle would fly over the wall and explode when it landed. Maybe that's why there were so many Utah raptors that didn't appear to have riders at the time. I picked my target, a group of Utah raptors just milling around, and started shooting them. One of the dinosaurs had a rider on its back, and he jumped off as my bullet killed the raptor. The rider threw an actual grenade at me as I shot him. It landed a few feet from me, but thinking fast, I whacked it with the butt end of my gun, and it flew into another crowd of the attackers. There was at least 10 riders taken out by the explosion. All casualties were humans, as there were no dinosaurs among the group. As I hurried to cross the street, I spotted both human and dinosaur marauders attacking the building that served as a makeshift treatment center housing the most critically wounded from the previous attack. Several people, who volunteered to work as nurses, were standing outside, armed with automatic weapons, and were defending the entrance. Their bravery was to be commended, but sadly it was all in vain. A dino rider threw another grenade that went crashing through one of the building's windows. I watched the guards go inside to rescue whomever they could in the few seconds they had, but no one ever came out. I raised my gun to fire at the dino rider who had thrown the grenade. My gun clicked. Oh shit! I remember saying as I realized I'd never put a fresh clip in after the last attack ended. Didn't have time to think of something brilliant though, because a large man holding an axe charged at me. I dropped my gun and picked up a long section of metal pipe that was laying close by, likely thrown out of a building by an explosion. I ducked when the man swung for my head, and then I swung my pipe upward, striking the man in the chin and making him tumble back. Spino had seen what was happening and got behind the rider as I swung again. The man tumbled backward, landing in Spino's open jaws. Spino slammed his massive jaws shut, and I could hear the crunch of the dino rider's body as Spino crushing him. By now, most of the buildings in the immediate area were on fire, but most of our people didn't panic. With Spino's help, I managed to rally our people into a defensive wall that began forcing the dino riders back. The buildings on the street that weren't on fire were being heavily defended by several of our people who'd ran inside them and began shooting at the dino riders from out of open second-story windows. These buildings also offered safe places to take the wounded. Many had been hurt. I vividly remember the grisly wounds left on those who had survived being mauled by the Utah raptors. I couldn't stand to look at them, and visualizing them now makes me feel ill. How we pulled it off, I still don't understand. It was honestly... I was so into the moment that I don't remember all of it. That as a rallied force, we pushed the dino riders into a second retreat and secured the town again. It almost felt like divine intervention. We won the fight, but we all knew that unless something changed, we'd be in the same situation again. And after everything that had happened, our ship was close to sinking. We knew that one more attack would be enough to ruin us. We had to be the ones to make a decisive blow, but we needed more people to do it. As much as Spino proved to be a near unstoppable force in battle, he wasn't enough by himself. Thankfully, it turned out others were thinking like I was and knew we needed to find some new allies to help us defeat the raiders. I'll skip the details of that night of treating the wounded, because it was so gory that I'd rather forget it entirely. When the sun came up, I was exhausted, soaked in drying blood, and apparently, I laid down on the grass and passed out from exhaustion. Spino says he took me to the same isolated area that I had napped earlier so he could watch over me until I woke up. He wanted me to have a proper rest despite what anyone else might have thought about it. He's sweet for a Spinosaurus. No?
I woke up, cradled in his claws, that afternoon, more mentally worn out than I'd ever been before in my life. After a while of laying there on the earth's floor, sore and still exhausted despite sleeping most of the day away, I knew that I had to help out the short-handed community. So I stretched and went to join the cleanup of the charred rubble. After the multiple attacks, at least half the buildings and homes were burned beyond any hope of repair, and they'd have to be torn down and built anew. Obviously, that wasn't something that could happen at all until the conflict was over, and that same afternoon, we held a town meeting in the small park to discuss how our new beginning could be brought about. The atmosphere from the people in that meeting is something I will never forget. There was a feeling of loss, despair, acceptance of defeat, yet a twinge of defiance lingered. There was an undertone of determination. We all wanted to overcome the horrors we had all seen. Those feelings took root in my mind and others. When someone shared the idea of sending some people out to look for another group, an established group that could help us, I instantly volunteered to do it. Mark jumped up and announced he'd come with me. Of course, Spino declared he wasn't going to let me go out there on my own. After the meeting ended, we were given what supplies could be spared: food, water, guns, and ammunition. We left shortly after that, accepting the well wishes of all those who stayed behind. After walking at a quick pace for most of the day, we set up a temporary camp as the sun finally began to set. Spino went off by himself and later returned with, no surprise, a deer. We happily butchered it, roasted it, and ate well. Eventually, Mark and I went into our own tents. It was too dangerous to sleep under the stars given the circumstances, because anywhere with the dinosaurs around was already dangerous. We chose the safest place to sleep we could, away from the road, where it would be hard to see us. Spino wrapped himself around our tents, supplying a wall of protection, and he watched over us throughout the night. I remember the wonderful moment that we finally found what we were looking for. It happened right around midday. A community of people had set themselves up in what was once a pioneer village. Like our community, they also built a wall around themselves. Their wall was completely made of wood and not layered over with steel, and their gates swung open instead of sliding on a track like ours did. They had guards posted along the walls, and when we told them that we were from a nearby community and we had a proposal to form an alliance, they let us inside, took our guns, and escorted us to the man in charge. That man, Arnold, is still in charge today. He was a very no-nonsense, down-to-earth kind of fella, with a rather wonderful daughter. We told him everything, and if we were successful, we'd split the spoils of war between our communities 50-50. He agreed to help us for one reason. It turned out that they, too, were fighting the Dino Riders, and he felt that as a united group, we could defeat them. We stayed as their guests while they prepared their militia for a fight. Like us, their militia was a ragtag group. 2 mornings later, Mark, Spino, and I returned to our community with a surplus of fresh supplies and an even larger number of fresh fighters. Shortly after returning, I was filled in on what we had missed while scouting. There had been a few skirmishes with the Dino Riders, but no further large battles. Why the Dino Riders had scaled back their attacks, no one knew for certain, but many believed that they were likely scavenging supplies, preparing to attack again. Our scouts also found the true location of the Dino Riders' camp. It turned out that the camp we attacked earlier was either a smaller camp set up away from the main one, or, more likely, I think, nothing but a decoy camp. Thinking about it now, I think it probably was exactly that. Especially because they hadn't even remotely tried to conceal it. Their true camp was placed in the center of a very large field surrounded by trees. Because of the trees, no one could see the camp, and it had remained hidden.
Now that we had joined with another group, we also realized that we now outnumbered the Dino Riders, though their numbers remained larger if you counted both Human Rider and their Utah Raptor as separate entities. But with the realization, we planned to use overwhelming force combined with the element of surprise to sweep them away. It could work if we pulled it off right. Though pulling that if off was much easier to do in theory than it was in reality. As we were leaving the community, and to calm himself, Mark started explaining more details about his cabin to me. I got it all planned out. You see, I'll get the lumber from the woods just outside of town. We got a spot marked to turn into a logging camp. Okay? Then, I'll build the walls once I get it all sawed up. I want the whole log cabin package. Dirt floor, straw bed, fireplace for cooking and warmth, built from the ground up with good old-fashioned saws, hammers, and nails. There also is enough unused brick in the community just lying against one of the walls that I can use for a nice chimney, he described. It'll be really nice, I replied. The image described depicted a rosy little cabin that anyone could see as homely. He continued on, and you'd be welcome anytime. We could chat or play cards. I like games like Hand and Foot, 3 a.m., poker, Texas Hold'em, if you know it, Rat Slap, Blackjack, Crazy Eights, any card game, really. He seemed to realize that he was beginning to ramble and caught himself with a chuckle. Then he carried on. I can also make us dinner. I make a real mean gumbo. My aunt taught me how to make it. She learned of this old local recipe while living on the Gulf Coast of Florida. Might need to use crayfish as a substitute for a few ingredients, but I could make it work. I also have a great stew recipe, one that I came up with myself. Mark was certainly a man who liked talking. He was terrific, but often gave too many details. I was okay with that, since he was such a positive man to talk with. And I loved that someone was already looking toward a future with no conflicts with the dinosaur riders. Even in the midst of an apocalypse, Mark thought of card games and happy times to come. There was something to admire about someone being able to do that. He never lost that hopeful outlook. Still, there were times one should talk and when one should not. While I didn't say anything, I felt that the current moment was not the right time for such chatter. A short time later, we left the road. We had walked the entire way to ensure silence and as much stealth as possible, and we began sneaking close to the camp. Passing through the mostly pine trees, we stayed in the cover their foliage provided until we reached the edge of the field. Our plan was to use the very tall grass and crawl as close to the camp as possible, and then light the place up with a hail of bullets. Spino had been instructed to hang back until the shooting started, and he would be able to charge in and join the battle. A battle that we hoped would decide everything. That is exactly what it did, too. We crawled on our bellies through the thick grass, steadily getting close to the Dino Riders' camp. I remember counting down the distance left as we snuck close, like a pack of raptors closing in for the kill. We snuck closer, counted down the distance between us and the camp. 50 feet. Then it was 40. Then, we're 30 feet away and still hidden within the tall grass. Some of us were closer than 20 feet when we stood up, revealing ourselves and opened fire at the unsuspecting and unprepared marauders. The first thing I did was shoot a large Utah Raptor that then tumbled back into a teepee-like tent with a shriek just popped. The initial surprise of our attack did do its job. The Dino Riders briefly panicked and had nowhere to go for real cover. Many of them simply ran straight to our bullets. The initial barrage had been particularly devastating, but we quickly realized that they were taking what cover they could and hiding themselves inside the camp. If we didn't do something, they'd recuperate or slip away. So we did something to make sure that they did not have that chance. With Spino right behind us, we charged into the camp, still shooting throughout the whole encounter as we began to hunt them down. A tense, close-quarters gunfight broke out, something that honestly looked like it belonged in some World War II movie, one that just had dinosaurs in it. At the time, I couldn't tell who was winning. I did see someone on our side who was standing to my right fall after getting hit by a bullet. I aimed and shot the rider who had shot whoever had been standing next to me. If the situation was less hectic at that moment, I'd have tried to see if I could have helped whoever it was. But the situation didn't allow it, and I had to continue on deeper into the camp. The minutes dragged on. Spino circled the camp and picked off any dino riders who were trying to run away. Though, he did tell me later he wasn't able to get all of them, and several, probably a dozen or more, did manage to escape the battle and flee into the forest. We haven't seen any signs of them since. They probably rode as far away as they could. The rest of us, meanwhile, focused on encircling around the camp as best as we could and hunting down whoever was still alive inside of it. Our plan did work. The Dino Riders were defeated by the end of the battle. Those left at that point were scattered around the camp, but were steadily hunted down and killed. We were not in the mood to take prisoners at that time. It was as the battle was winding down that I found out who it had been that I'd seen get shot next to me. It was Mark. I remember when I saw him, he was reaching towards me, extending his hand, asking for help, comfort. I ran to his side and took his hand, crouching next to him as I did so. I remember our words we exchanged vividly. They're etched into my brain as permanently as words written in stone. He'd been shot in the gut, and we both knew he wouldn't make it back to the community. No, I think he knew more than I wanted to, if I'm being honest. I supported his head as he tried to sit up, but he found he was unable to. "Thank you, Nick," he said between gasps and small spasms. "You were my friend, my good friend. Now I'm going to be with my mama." Tears fell from his eyes, and I squeezed his hand harder. It wasn't fair. He had been one of the most down-to-earth, wholesome men I'd ever known. The kind of person who deserved a long and happy life. All I could do in that moment was comfort him as he lay dying. I kept the tears from my eyes as best I could. I wanted to be strong and supportive for Mark in those last moments of his. Will you build my cabin?" he then asked me. That was enough to break my resolve, so, crying, I nodded. Damn right, you better believe I built that cabin, just like he had wanted. "Thank you. I always wanted a cabin like that," he said to me. "You'll get it," I assured him. "Thank you, my friend," he'd replied. Those were his last words. We loaded our dead into trucks we brought out following the battle, so they could be taken home and buried. We left the bodies of the Dino Riders, human and dinosaur alike, where they lay. As we left the camp, the first scavengers, in this case an Antionosaurus, were already starting to show up. I saw an Allosaurus also approaching the camp the last time I looked back. Prehistoric carnivores descended upon the scene quicker than vultures descend on carrion.
The next few months passed peacefully. I was at the forefront of rebuilding the community, and they grew to see me as the leader. I didn't want the job, but I took it just as quietly as I'd been elected to it. I'm still the leader today, trying my best to make my little pocket of civilization flourish in this new world turned into a crazy mix of Silurian, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Eocene, and everything before, after, and in between. And it's not just us in Arnold's community either. We found 2 others as well. There are 4 communities of survivors doing the same thing as we are, and I bet there are others out there too. Other places where people are doing what we're doing. Just wonder if we'll ever find them. And you know, despite the conflict, we were lucky. Luckier than most people out there probably, because most people are likely still scattered all over the place and just traveling in groups from one point to the next. We're not moving place to place on the road, scavenging abandoned cars in the hopes of finding enough food to not starve. We have a home. Mark's cabin was truly something once it had been finished. I built it just like he had said he wanted it, down to the little details, making it as perfect as I possibly could. I know he would have loved it. Mark was one of those people who only come once in a lifetime. He was just the definition of a good man, a good friend. And he had been taken from all of us far too soon. Every few months, I always make sure that I go put fresh flowers on his grave, which was next to a church that we built ourselves. It seemed to be fitting to have one in the community that we'd made home. It is just one of many buildings that we've added to the community, and it will be far from the last. I've also changed since the conflict. Like everyone else I share my new home with has. Sometimes, in the time shortly after the fighting had ended, I come up to this same hill that I'm sitting on as I write this now and just sit. I'd think about the new world that had fully set in. I'd think about what I'd and everyone had been forced to do to survive. I'd also think about the future, taking that lesson from Mark. Tomorrow wasn't an impossible goal to reach. I'd seen so much, so I knew we could make it happen. And it seems that we're well on our way of doing it too. I've also come to peace with the terrible things I had to do. That's not all that's different about me now. I have a wife now too. Arnold's wonderful daughter that I mentioned. The most beautiful, loving, maybe overprotective just a bit, woman I've ever known. And my wife and I are actually talking about having a kid. I didn't think it would ever happen. But if we do, I know that the moment I wrap my arms around them for the first time will change me in some ways I just don't understand yet. If we do have kids, I'm excited to show them the world, to show them how to grow up in it. And I'm excited to build a world for them where they'll have a good future. Again, tomorrow is not an impossible goal to reach. When I found that egg years ago, just sitting unassumingly on a rotting log, I never thought that it would lead to this. Spino is the reason I'm here. I owe him my life and this new chance I've been given. It is a gift and a blessing that I will not waste. Whatever happens in the future, whatever happens tomorrow, I know one thing. I know that it is going to be good. It is going to be a new beginning in a new world taken over by the ancient past. I found what I was meant to do, And I know now who I really am. For the first time in my entire life, I know who I am and what I was looking for. I found my missing piece. It was only early morning, and yet it was already hot and steamy outside. The sun burned brightly just above the tree line. The heat and golden glow of it caused a massive, black-scaled dinosaur to stir from his sleep, and his red eyes slid open as the sunlight shone directly onto his face. Spino lifted his head off the ground and yawned, flashing his large shining fangs and deep maw off briefly before he chomped his jaws closed. He shook his head and stood up. He started walking on all fours for a short moment before he stood up on his back legs and moseyed down the street towards the community's gate. Once the gate was opened for him, he exited the walled-off neighborhood and entered the forest outside of the town. He headed to the same place he always did first thing in the morning, the nearest stream. The stream was deep enough for him to swim in, and it was full of fish to eat. After a short walk through the forest, he reached the stream and waded into the water. He began to lazily drift in the gentle current as he continued to wake up. Life was good, and things were peaceful. Perfect mornings, like this one, were the best time to reflect on the goodness in his life. The peacefulness meant Spino could enjoy lazy mornings, like he did before the apocalypse. Yes, even dinosaurs enjoyed lazy mornings when they weren't caught up in the fast and furious fight for survival in a harsh world. As he continued to contentedly drift along, his claws gently scratching along the bottom of the stream. Occasionally, this would dig up some rocks and stir up the sandy creek bottom, clouding the clear water around him. Spino opened his jaws and took a big drink of water. Though, no fish happened to be swimming close enough to get sucked into. But that was fine. The early morning sun's golden rays shone through the trees and into the cool water, turning it a vibrant gold. Spino was more than content, even though he hadn't caught a fish yet. Simply drifting along for a time, as his sleepy mind cleared, was just fine with him. It was the perfect way to start a day. Hey! Spino was stirred out of his contented daze by the sound, and he turned his gaze to face the source of the voice. Nick's 9-year-old daughter sat on the riverbank, waving. You left without me, she called. I can't help it you were still asleep, Mabel, Spino replied, with a dinosaur version of a smirk, lifting his head out of the water as he spoke. Usually, she was out of the house and waking him up for their morning walk before he was so much as stirring from sleep. It was their usual morning routine, one Spino pretended to be annoyed by, but he loved it, and Mabel knew full well that he did. Spino then got slightly more serious, the smile vanishing from his face. Hey, how'd you get outside of the gates? He asked. She knew leaving alone was not allowed, and he knew that there was no way the guards would have let her go out alone, no matter how stubbornly she argued with them. When I saw you were gone, I found a place that I could sneak out, she admitted, acting like she'd been caught between a rock and a hard place. There's a spot near the back of the community where I can easily climb over the wall. Mabel, Spino firmly stressed. What? I knew you were coming here. It's just a minute or two run. I was careful, she insisted, cutting Spino off before he could lecture her. Spino sighed, frustrated by her carelessness, though he understood why she took the chance. Having been born into such a chaotic world, and being surrounded by prehistoric animals constantly, she didn't understand the threat they presented like people who had to adapt when they reappeared did. No matter how often she was told to be careful, she just didn't see why she couldn't go or do whatever she wanted. Spino sighed, abashed by her recklessness, even though he understood why she felt sneaking out was acceptable instead of waiting for him to come back. He wanted to say more, but after a moment, he dropped the subject without saying anything else. He kept the immediate area around the community clear of most dangerous animals, but he could only do so much. Rogues always slipped into his territory. But instead of lecturing Mabel about both breaking the rules and her carelessness, which would have been a waste of time, and because no harm had been done, he instead asked in a playful tone, "Are you coming in, or are you just going to sit there and watch me swim?" Having her closer to him where he could better protect her would make him feel better about the situation. "Sure, just don't mistake me for a fish again like you did the last time," Mabel giggled, jumping into the water from a large rock, surfacing after a moment. "Hey, I can't help it you swam that close. And sometimes it's hard to tell when something is underwater." "There's a lot of big fish around here, kiddo," Spino replied with a gentle but playful chuckle. Mabel paddled over and grabbed onto his nose. "Sure it is. You just like to goad me, don't you?" she said with playful accusation. "Mabel Edwards, I never! Isn't having fun at your siblings' expense what big brothers are supposed to do?" Spino asked. "Yeah, but they don't usually nearly eat their siblings. Again, you swim close enough, I had to have a little fun. And don't pretend that you didn't think it was hilarious afterwards. And don't say I nearly ate you. You weren't even inside my mouth or even close to it," Spino replied. "I'm a dinosaur. What do you expect my sense of humor to be, anyway?" As he said it, he couldn't help but wonder if Mabel didn't sometimes forget he was actually a dinosaur since she was around him so much. Just like how she often forgot how dangerous the world in which she was growing up truly was. She had known no other life from the day that she was born, after all. "Especially when all of my family members are bite-sized," Spino continued. "And besides, all I really did was splash you, and you know it." "Sure," Mabel replied with another laugh as she wiped some water off her face and brushed her hair to the side to get it out of her eyes. "You tell yourself that, big guy." Spino simply shook his head as Mabel climbed up and sat across his snout, her limbs still dangling in the water. Life was most definitely good, and she only made it better. A posse of 4 horses rode down the empty highway at a full gallop, their riders clinging tightly to stay on and not be thrown off. The tumultuous movement of the horses' legs left a swirling mass of leaves and pine needles stirred up in its wake. The riders were in a hurry after hearing a report from one of their scouts about a serious situation they would meet on the road a short distance ahead of them. It was a situation that involved an important bridge being used for travel between the distant communities. The riders rode straight past an allosaurus that bellowed warningly at them from the side of the road. Once they passed, it huffed and carried its breakfast, a white-tailed deer, off the road and into the forest to eat without further disruption. Once upon a time, such animals would have stopped the riders dead in their tracks. However, these riders had seen such animals so many times since civilization collapsed, almost 11 years ago, that they barely gave the dinosaur so much as a glance. As soon as the posse's destination was visible ahead, and the 4 riders slowed their horses to a quick trot, they came to a complete stop once they arrived at the scene. "I told you it was bad," one of the riders said. "You didn't say it was this bad," Nick replied, climbing off his horse and walking to the end of the bridge. He was careful not to step onto it just in case his weight would be enough to send the rest of it crashing into the river below. He turned to the scout who had reported it as destroyed. "Half the bridge is gone, Steve. That's more than bad. This could be catastrophic." "I didn't do an in-depth inspection. I was looking through my binoculars on the way here during my patrol," his eyes gazing from Nick to the bridge. "And I went to report it, per protocol," Steve replied. The bridge in question was an old iron one that spanned a small river. The water level was up dramatically, and the fast-flowing floodwaters caused by a storm to the north had finally beaten the near-century-old structure too much, and half the bridge had fully collapsed into the river. Large sections of the bridge that had fallen had been swept away by the rushing torrent. "It doesn't matter," Nick sighed, waving Steve off. "We have enough wood stored at that old sawmill that we should be able to fix it, though it'll take nearly all that we have cut. We'll have to cut more after if we want to have enough wood for winter." He looked at the other two riders from the community. Go ahead and ride back. I want plans to fix this drawn up by the end of the morning. And make sure Donald knows that all the communities use this trade route. We need to get it fixed. He continued, walking back to his horse and climbing into the saddle. Make a sign to post that clearly explains the road is closed just in case anyone tries to move through this route. And watch yourselves. It's dangerous out there, he added, as the other two turned and rode back the way the group had come from. Two men paused, just long enough for one of them to take a picture of the scene with an old Polaroid camera. They turned and rode off, vanishing up the road after a matter of seconds. Once Nick was on his horse, he turned and faced Steve. These summer storms aren't going to let up. Let's check the bridge on the secondary route and make sure it's not out too. If it is, then we have an even bigger problem on our hands. With that, Nick and Steve turned their horses and rode back down the road. But instead of turning in the direction of the community at the first intersection they came to, they turned to the left and headed towards the secondary route further downstream. As they rode, Nick noted that the woods around them seemed still, and the only sounds other than the horses were the singing insects. If the forest was this silent, it meant that something dangerous was around, and you had to keep your wits about you. Well, at least we haven't seen any dinosaurs, Steve called. Well, other than the one that was stuffing its gut. Don't ever say that. One will show up at the worst time if you do. And don't let your guard down, Nick reprimanded. Haven't you noticed how silent the woods around here are? They moved on without speaking again. And as they neared the second bridge, Nick suddenly pulled his horse to a stop. Softly, he said, Whoa, whoa. He turned to face Steve, who also stopped his horse and pointed down at the road. Nick whispered, There's fresh Dimetrodon tracks crossing the road here, and they're heading towards the bridge. You see the mud they trailed? Let's leave the horses here and go on foot. It'll be quieter, and the bridge is only about a mile ahead. Dimetrodon was a large, four-legged carnivore with a sail that ran along its spine. It was a Permian-era genus of non-mammalian synapsid, with large teeth that were diversely shaped and positioned, which gave the animal a wicked bite from which very few survived. Dimetrodons also had a long tail, and despite looking like a dinosaur, it was more of a distant relative to humans instead. They also tended to be just about as reasonable as most humans were. Not at all. Like a bear, they were fast enough to catch a running person in a few strides, and were very dangerous to meet if they were in groups. The fresh tracks left on the road seemed to indicate a rather large group was lurking within the surrounding forest. Leaving the horses loosely tied to a tree so they could pull free if threatened, and taking a rifle each, Nick and Steve followed the tracks in the road. Creeping along quietly, they kept their eyes on the surrounding forest in case other Dimetrodon happened to be around. It wasn't uncommon to find multiple groups in the same area. In fact, Nick liked to say that if there was one group of them around, there was likely two more in the immediate area. As Nick and Steve walked along, the forest stayed quiet. Suddenly, the sound of birds fluttering away in fright caused both men to aim their weapons in the direction of the noise. They had nearly walked the full mile, and the bridge was visible just ahead. This bridge was a much newer one than the iron one, and it should have been able to withstand the abuse from the rushing floodwaters. Nick hoped that meant it had survived the overnight torrent. After hesitating for a moment and seeing nothing, Nick and Steve nodded to one another and then continued moving slowly forward. They kept their guns raised and ready to fire. When they reached a position where the bridge was fully visible, they both stopped. It's intact, Steve whispered. Yeah, and the tracks go off the road just ahead. The Dimetrodon were likely heading to the river, but let's not stick around. I don't fancy becoming an early lunch for the alpha predator of the Permian era, Nick whispered back. They both quietly, but quickly retreated to the grazing horses, which were still where they'd been left. As Nick climbed onto his horse, he noticed that the forest continued to be unnervingly silent, and he wondered if it was something other than the prehistoric carnivores that had caused the animals to go silent.
Even the insects had stopped singing. After pausing long enough to take a mental note of the silence, he and Steve started riding back towards the community. "Well?" Nick asked Donald, the community's head of construction projects. "Well, I looked over the pictures of the damage and drew these up," Donald replied, laying out a sheet of paper for Nick to see. "We have enough wood to fix the bridge, no problem, but if the water keeps flowing as hard as it has been, it will fall apart again in a few weeks, because we're going to have to build off the same foundation that gave way. We should wait until the water goes down, and then maybe we can figure out a workaround." "Donald, there's three things about waiting that you didn't take into consideration. That's the main trade route between the four communities, and it's the quickest route to Arnold's community, and it's also the only road still in decent shape. You take a wagon down the secondary route, and at the very least you'll lose a wheel. If you're lucky, it'll only be just the one. Then you know what happens? You get robbed by some roaming bandits, or you become lunch for some Desplatosaurus, or heaven forbid, Tyrannosaurus that happens along. You want that to happen? Because it will if someone tries to move down the secondary route. That road is too far gone to fix, so the old bridge is the only choice. Besides, the summer storms aren't going to stop. So we must work with the best road option, because that's the hand we've been dealt." Donald sighed. "I'll talk to Aaron about it. He was the risk analyst in the old world, not me. You know that I just drew up the plans on the computer for my father's company. I do it on paper. I'll let you know what he says." With that, Donald took the plans he had drawn up and left the table. He'd been fully honest with Nick. He was brilliant with planning construction with limited resource, but useless when it came to assessing risk and calculating it. He had tried to learn the skill, but he struggled with it. Even before the apocalypse, his job had never involved calculating risks. He had been the one who had done the construction plans at his father's self-owned company, A. Levinson's Construction Company, because his father, Andrew, had known his son never to make mistakes with any type of construction planning, an ability supposedly passed down from Donald's grandfather. Someone else in the company always did the risk calculations. When Nick met Donald while out on a supply run with Spino, he had picked up what skills Donald had almost right away. Donald, deviously skilled with using only a few resources, had built several traps around his shelter, and, like Donald's father, Nick had never known him to make a single error. Donald had been key in reinforcing the original steel-plated walls that surrounded the community by adding more metal in areas and other reinforcement materials, including some concrete the community had scavenged. He had many strengths, but the skills needed for risk assessment remained elusive to him. Nick held his meeting with Donald in the old shelter house in the center of the community. The shelter housed several tables in a large section of the community that served as a recreation area for those in the town. Nick sighed, walked outside, and stood in the street. He muttered to himself, "Why do I try to get straight answers from people? Maybe I should partner with the guy who can help make sure the plans work correctly, instead of wasting my time." For all his construction smarts, Donald often spoke in circles unless he had the actual answer you wanted, and that usually didn't happen right away. It seemed he always avoided getting to the root of the issue. Nick usually had to encourage Donald to go to whoever knew how to resolve the problem at hand and adjust his plans accordingly. It was frustrating at times, but Donald would come through in the end. He always had. That didn't make the process of getting the answer any less frustrating at times. "Nick?" Nick smiled at the sound of the voice, his worries instantly draining away for a moment, and turned to face his wife. "Good morning. Sorry for taking off before coffee was even done. Something unfortunate came up." Susan smiled understandingly. "It's okay. When you fall in love with the community leader, you have to get used to spending time alone." She wrapped her arms around her husband's neck. "You're always home in the evenings, so that makes up for it," she added, as Nick returned the hug with a satisfied sigh. "So, what was the problem?" she asked. Nick sniffed her hair and answered, "Is
What is the problem, you mean? It's ongoing at the moment. He stepped back. I'll tell you, but I want to show you something first. Something to brighten the day and apologize for running off. Running off again? Susan clarified. Nick nodded. Yeah, again, he chuckled. Though it was frowned upon, they went outside of the community without an escort, and Nick took Susan to a nearby field at the top of a hill. He used to sit there with Spina back in the early days after the community gained some stability. It was the same place he used to sit overlooking the town as he filled out his journal. His journal was now used by the community as an educational record of the early months of the apocalypse, one of several records that had been compiled into a historic omnibus about the community's development, people, and events. Should we be out here? Susan asked. It's okay, Nick assured her. Spino keeps this area clear of other dinosaurs. It's his territory, after all. They stopped at the top of the hill, which had a thick layer of tall grass growing across it. I discovered this little trick by accident, but it's a very cool sight to see. But you have to come in the morning, Nick said, taking Susan's hand and pulling her close to his side. He then pulled out a silver pistol with blue patterns on its side from his holster. He'd found it on a supply run early in the apocalypse and had kept it as his own weapon. Firing it into the air once, the grass around them exploded with fluttering blue feathers and large birds that took to the sky in a choir of panicked calls. Susan gasped, watching open-mouthed as the birds flew in tight formations in various loops for a few moments before taking to the sky. As they flew upward, they vanished into the blue, their feathers making it seem like they dissolved into the sky. Nick leaned against her, an action she returned, and chuckled, watching the sky with a smile. The display the birds put on was as stunning as the first time he'd watched it, and he never grew tired of it. What are they? Susan asked. I don't know. Some species of prehistoric bird. I know they aren't from the modern age, Nick replied, sliding the pistol back into its holster. They stood on the hill and quietly watched the sky, enjoying a quiet moment spent together after a tumultuous morning. The bridge is out. That's the problem, Nick explained once he and Susan had returned to the community. On the main route? Yeah, I want to get it fixed within the week. The secondary route is secondary for a reason. It's become nearly unpassable. Honestly, we should investigate cleaning some of the other roads and closing the current secondary route for good, Nick replied, stopping at the base of the wall just inside the gate. I'm waiting on Donald and Aaron to give me some news on when we can start with repairs. Until that's done, we're between a rock and a hard place. The flooding leaves us no way to reach our friends. Susan nodded. Was Mabel gone when you left? She asked. No, but Spino was awake, Nick replied. Susan sighed. Well, she was gone when I went up to her room. She wasn't anywhere in the house, and I didn't see her outside. Nick wasn't really surprised. She probably went with Spino and we didn't notice. She goes out with him every morning. She probably just caught up with him on his way out, and we both just missed her. Don't worry. You know he won't let anything happen to her. Susan nodded, agreeing that Mabel was most likely with Spino. Nick was probably right. Perhaps they both happened to just miss seeing her. She was about to reply when her thoughts were interrupted by a voice. Hey, Nick! Aaron shouted from across the street. I have some good news for you! After running some numbers, looking at potential scenarios, going over available resources, and considering the expected weather for the coming weeks, Aaron had decided that they could begin making repairs on the destroyed bridge while the waters were still high. He had come up with a plan that, if everyone followed a few requirements he had written down, would allow them to begin building even with the floodwaters still high. Repairs on the bridge started the next day. The community used a set of large wagons that were hauled by either a set of 4 horses or 2 massive harnessed triceratops. The horses were used to pull the lighter loads in wagons, and the tamed triceratops were used to pull the heavier loads. Despite the heat, the community made good progress on the repairs. Everyone who could was taking part to make the work go faster. Soon, they had the structure constructed and were adding wooden planks that covered the floor of the bridge. Nick helped Steve slide a freshly cut plank into an empty spot, and they began to nail it in place. Have you and Susan decided on whether or not you're going to have any more kids? Steve asked as he hammered one of his nails into the plank. Nick looked up at him and chuckled. Mabel's about all we can handle. She's going to worry her mother to death without the help of a new partner in crime. Yesterday morning, Susan thought Mabel snuck out, but Spino swore to me that she was with him the whole time. I think we both just happened to miss her leaving the house. Steve laughed at the reply, as Nick added, but Susan insists, and this is hush-hush now, but we're waiting to see if her next monthly cycle comes as usual. The news was so unexpected that Steve let the hammer slip and almost smashed his finger. But most men were wearing gloves made from a leather-like material, a mix of lithornax and cave lion hide. And the material offered enough protection that the hammer blow didn't hurt when it landed. Steve didn't even notice it, in fact. He just chuckled. Congratulations might soon be in order then. What about you? You're not too old, Nick replied. Steve sighed and finished hammering the nail into place. No, he shook his head. What happened with my family back at the start? No. I'm never going to be a father again. Hey, it's been over a decade, Nick said, standing up. Don't beat yourself up over it forever. It's my fault they died. I wasn't there. If you'd been there, you'd be dead too, Nick replied. But maybe they would have survived, Steve countered with a slight shake of his head. You can't assume that to be true, Nick insisted. After a few seconds, Steve sighed and looked away. Did our boys give you an idea for how long repairs on this thing will take? Deciding to change the subject, Nick nodded. If we keep this pace up, no longer than a week at the most. That's faster than expected, which is good. I want to beat the next storm. Well, that could be any day. Exactly, Nick replied, grabbing another nail. One of the workers helping with the bridge was standing alongside the tree line away from the main group. He was cutting some boards into small pieces. He suddenly paused and looked toward the trees. He could have sworn he heard a faint whisper coming from somewhere within, like a breeze whispering through the leaves. It sounded like the words, "New time." The worker didn't see anything or anyone, so he moved a little closer to the dense foliage. A few seconds later, the leaves exploded outward as a group of 3 Coelophysis darted out. One, presumably a male due to its more vivid and colorful patterns, was carrying a dead Leptictidium in its mouth. The 3 dinosaurs ran past the worker and down the bank toward the edge of the river. The worker sighed, assuming the strange voice was just the 3 dinosaurs making an odd sound that happened to sound like human words. He went back to sawing the board and gave the matter no further thought. Mabel and Spino were once again swimming in their creek. This time, they were playing a game of tag at Mabel's insistence. She was convinced that she could outswim Spino, and while he was more than happy to entertain his sister, he was not about to let her believe wild ideas such as that. Come back, my little fish, Spino called, deepening his voice. He'd given her a head start, but was rapidly closing the distance. Mabel stopped swimming and turned to face him. I'm not a fish! You swim like one. Well, you won't catch me like you do a real fish, Mabel giggled, and dove under the water, swimming as fast as she could. Spino rolled his eyes, snorted in an amused way, and then followed, using his powerful legs and strong tail to speed up his movement through the water. He began to close the distance even faster than before, and by the time Mabel came back up for air, Spino was able to reach out and poke her with his finger. Tag, he said. Dang it, Mabel complained, splashing water in the dinosaur's direction. How'd you catch me? she asked. I'm a fast swimmer, Spino replied, chuckling as he spoke, the water from the splash running down and dripping off his scaly nose. I guess so, Mabel grumbled. Spino nudged his nose against her. Oh, don't be like that. My hand is still bigger than you, so of course I'm faster. Hey, you want to see just how fast I can swim? Mabel looked up at him. Water dripped from her hair, and she smiled. Sure! Relieved that she wasn't still pouting, Spino smiled. Climb on then, he said, motioning to the back of his neck with his head. Mabel swam over, climbed on, and once she was ready, Spino turned with a large splash of water and swam back down the stream in the opposite direction. After passing a few forks and taking a few turns, Mabel saw that he had swum into a large lake. She imagined what it had looked like years before, when there would have been boats zooming around on the water and people swimming at the beaches. Then, her imaginings went back to millions of years ago, when there would have been giant fish, and massive marine reptiles, and semi-aquatic carnivores, and herbivorous dinosaurs swimming around in lakes like this one. Ready? Spino asked. Yeah, Mabel replied. Hang on and take a breath. I'm diving, Spino said, tensing and then rearing up before diving down into the water. Mabel took a deep breath as he dove under, and she clung on tightly. Mabel took a deep breath as he dove under, and she clung on tightly. Under the surface of the lake, the sunlight appeared golden, and the water was murky brown, mixed with green. Spino propelled himself through the water and moved faster than Mabel thought possible. He spun gracefully around submerged logs and even arched beautifully over the wreck of a sunken pontoon boat. Spino's red eyes scanned the dim water, and he snapped at a large catfish as it glided past. Spino's black scales blended in perfectly with the underwater environment. His entire body, from head to the tip of his tail, was covered in black scales. Even his claws were the same color. The color made him blend into his watery environment and seemingly disappear while beneath the surface. His eyes, teeth, were the only parts of his body that deviated in color. Mabel felt a great thrill at the speed Spino was swimming, and, though the images were blurry, she was amazed by what she could see in the water. She soon felt the need for air and patted Spino on the neck a few times to let him know. Spino took the message and began swimming upward toward the golden light of the surface. Mabel burst out into a fit of laughter as Spino shot out of the water with a dramatic roar before they both crashed back into the lake with a massive splash. How are we doing with the wood? Nick asked, wiping sweat off his face. Donald checked some of the notes he'd taken during the day's construction and, after flipping through them, nodded approvingly. Using just as much as I'd hoped. No accidents at all. We'll need more soon, but another shipment is on its way from the old sawmill. Nick nodded. Good. You know, we should really try to get that place fixed up. Save a lot of time not having to cut all the wood ourselves. You have a lot of projects in mind, Nick. I have plans to make this world a good place to live in. The next generation is going to have to grow up in it, and we might as well make it as good a world for them as we possibly can, Nick chuckled. Donald laughed too. I'll run the idea by Dusty and Aaron, see what they think and get back to you. I didn't realize that Aaron had taken on an apprentice, Nick said. Oh yeah, Dusty is already on the road to outshining him, so I figure getting 2 opinions is better than 1. Numbers don't lie, but 2 people are less likely to make the same mistake. Anyway, even if your sawmill project is considered possible, we have more crucial projects that need to be finished before winter, so fixing that place up probably won't happen till next summer at the soonest, if it happens at all. Hey, it's your job, man. I just keep giving you more to do, Nick said with a small laugh. Donald chuckled again. Yeah, I totally appreciate that too, he said sarcastically. I've probably got enough blueprints for you in my house to fill up one of my hall closets. The walkie-talkies Nick and Donald were both wearing suddenly blared ecstatically, Hello? The voice sounded urgent. Donald grabbed his walkie first and asked, "Haley, is that you? Where's that shipment?" "You've got to help me. 2 Allosaurus came out of the woods and flipped us over. They got the horses, and I don't know if anyone else is left. I'm hiding under one of the wagons. They're still out there, sniffing around and eating whatever they find." The panic in her voice was obvious, even through the staticky radio. Nick and Donald locked eyes. "Oh shit," Nick said, grabbing his own walkie. Speaking calmly, he said, "We're on our way. You just hang tight. How far down the road are you?" "A quarter of the mile at most," Haley replied softly. "We're on our way," Nick replied, trying to be assuring as he began looking around. "That's close. It'll be quicker to get there on foot than untying, saddling, and getting on the horses," he quickly muttered, then shouted, "Everyone, grab the weapon you brought with you. A few of you stay here to guard the horses. The rest of you come with me." Nick ran to a tent that had been pitched in case someone needed to get out of the sun and grabbed a rifle sitting on a crate. Once he made sure it was loaded, he ran down the road, a large crowd following him. Once he was satisfied with his swim, Spino clambered out of the lake and shook himself off and, accidentally, knocked Mabel off into the shallow water. "Hey!" she shouted as she sat up. "I guess you should have hung on," Spino chuckled as he sauntered onto shore. There were lots of fossils mixed in with the rocks on the shore, and Mabel began examining them as Spino lay down on his stomach. He watched her for a short time and turned his sail to face the sun. Mabel found a large fossil that was likely once from some Carboniferous era plant or coral. She picked it up gently, and as she turned to show it to Spino, her eyes widened. "Spino?" she spoke. Spino raised his head and looked in the direction her eyes were focused, and he spotted an Allosaurus. The gray and silver-colored dinosaur was strolling onto the shore. The red crests on top of its head were angled in such a way that it made its eyes look as if they had an evil glare. Spino stood as Mabel backed up towards him. He strolled forward a few paces and planted one of his legs on either side of his sister protectively. The Allosaurus noticed and looked at Mabel and then glanced at Spino. Every time it glanced at Mabel, it looked like it had just seen the most delicious-looking snack on the planet, but it made no move towards her. It would make no move to come closer with the large Spinosaurus standing above her. It snarled, but seemed to lose interest. Instead, it walked to the water's edge, took a drink, and then left. It disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only its tail visible in the trees for an additional moment before it, too, vanished. Once the Allosaurus was gone, Spino looked down at Mabel. "Sneaking out of the community on your own to follow me yesterday was a stupid thing to do," he said. "I really should have said it then, but decided not to bring it up since it was a one-time event, and because I didn't think you would listen to me. But I think you get why now, though. What if you'd run into that thing while out on your own?" he asked. Mabel shivered. "I'd be dino food," she muttered, the reality of her reckless actions sinking in. "Yeah. So, I won't tell your father about yesterday morning, but don't do it again. Not even if I'm gone when you wake up," he said. "I think you sometimes forget how dangerous it is outside of the walls." "I think I forget too, because there's nothing out here that can really threaten me." Mabel nodded and looked down at the sand. She understood that sometimes she didn't appreciate just how dangerous the world could be. Spino relaxed, stepped back, and lay down again by Mabel's side. "That is a very nice fossil you found," he said. She smiled brightly and leaned against his snout. "It is nice. It's going in my room, right on the table next to my window." "Do you know what it is?" Spino asked, nudging her. Mabel giggled and examined her find. I think it's coral, or maybe..." She paused and looked at it from another angle and continued. "Oh, maybe it's a sea scorpion. The exposed bits look like an arthropod. Maybe. That would mean this came from an Ordovician-era ocean instead of some carboniferous jungle or bay or something. She felt giddy at the possibility of such a discovery. She'd read about such animals in some of her books on prehistory and dinosaurs, and she had always wanted to find a fossil of a sea scorpion since she first read about them. Seeing the excitement build back up in his little sister made Spino chuckle softly. Mabel got just as excited about the original prehistoric animals as she did about the revived ones, and Spino found it simply adorable. Haley stayed hidden under the upside-down wagon, closing her eyes tightly as the snarling, sniffing dinosaurs outside began to nudge the wagon around. She scooted as far from either side as she could when one stuck its tongue under the wagon, flinging saliva onto her head and arms. She closed her eyes again and held her knife and radio close. Suddenly, the wagon flipped back over and crashed onto the road a few meters away. Haley's eyes shot open as she made eye contact with the dinosaur standing above her. She could feel the other one's breath on the back of her neck on the opposite side. The male Allosaurus was colored black, with a blue streak running down its spine, and its belly was yellow. The female, on the other hand, was a light tan in color on its belly, and green covered most of her body, and her head crests were red. They snarled and lowered their heads to the ground to feed on their prey. Haley screamed and closed her eyes for the third time as the two open maws descended toward her. There was a gunshot, and the female started shaking her head and roaring in pain as blood dripped from where her eye should have been. Haley opened her eyes again and noticed the male was looking around for the threat. Nick lowered his rifle as a crowd of people came up behind him. "Nice shot," Steve complimented. The two Allosaurus hissed and began stalking towards the new threat. "Line up, one row behind the other one, and get ready to fire," Nick ordered. "Oh, Civil War style. You finally taken some lessons from history books?" Steve chuckled as he took a position at Nick's side. Nick glanced at Steve in mild annoyance. It was no time for joking, and he didn't respond to the inappropriate quip. His friend enjoyed reading about events like the Civil War every chance he could, and often encouraged Nick to do the same as well. Steve believed that learning about certain styles of living and combat could perhaps be adapted for their new world. It was perhaps a practical idea, but Nick never had time to read. His current combat style was simply a coincidence. "Aim high. Aim for their heads. We don't want to hit Haley on accident," Nick cautioned as he also took aim again. "Haley, get into the wagon!" someone from Nick's right shouted, but the girl seemed frozen where she lay. The female Allosaurus continued to stalk towards the line of people, but the male dinosaur seemed to pause and hang back. Because of this, when the order to fire was given, most people chose the nearest dinosaur as their target. It was pelted by a furious volley of fire. It roared and shook its head again as it was hit over and over, and then it charged, roaring louder and angrier. "Again!" Nick shouted. Suddenly, he changed his mind. "Forget that! Scatter to both sides of the road! Confuse her! Then bring her down with a second wave of bullets! Target her head, especially her neck!" No one noticed that the male Allosaurus had turned its attention back to Haley. As it lunged for her, she screamed and flattened herself on the road. The jaws opened wide above her, and she swung her arm upward in an arch, burying the knife in the roof of the dinosaur's mouth. The Allosaurus shrieked and shook its head over and over. The knife flew out of its jaws and into the forest. It then turned and glared at the girl on the ground, and slammed a claw-adorned foot down on her legs. Haley screamed as her legs were crushed under the dinosaur's foot. Meanwhile, the female Allosaurus was hit in the head by a second wave of gunfire from all sides. The damage to her neck proved to be too much, and she collapsed to the ground, bleeding heavily and spasming slightly. Moments later, she lay dead on the road. Everyone turned back to the male dinosaur, just in time to see it grab Haley by her shoulders in its jaws. It shook her violently until her scream stopped, and then it stalked off into the forest, vanishing into the trees with its prize. It happened so fast that the dinosaur had disappeared before anyone thought to raise their guns. Nick sighed after a moment. "Damn it, shit!" he said. Then he shouted and kicked a nearby bucket, which had likely been thrown from the wagon, off into the trees. "Someone go back to the bridge, get a horse, take it back to the community, and tell her brother, and figure out who else was in those wagons and tell their families too," Nick ordered solemnly, as he began to walk back towards the bridge, knowing there was nothing else to be done. "So, why is it that you like to tease me so much?" Mabel asked. "Or is there not a reason at all?" I think poke fun at is the better term," Spino replied. "But yes, there is a reason. Like I've explained before, isn't that what big brothers are supposed to do?" "Only if they have the maturity of a toddler," Mabel said, shaking her head at Spino's response. It had been a week since repairs on the bridge had come to an end. Security had been increased after the Allosaurus attack, but no further crises had occurred during the reconstruction. Repairs had been successful, much to everyone's delight, and things had returned to normalcy. All the while, Mabel and Spino had continued their normal routine of spending their days together in the forest surrounding the community. "But I'm the big, vicious dinosaur," Spino replied in a low, sinister growl. "One with big claws and jagged teeth," he added exaggeratedly. "You're a big softy is what you are," Mabel giggled, not fooled by the show at all. "And you have the maturity of a toddler." "Oh, is that what you think?" Spino asked. "Yep," Mabel giggled, hugging his nose. "But that's okay. I love you anyway, my big, vicious dinosaur brother." "Oh, you only love me when you want to make sure that the big, scary dinosaur doesn't eat you all up," he said in an even deeper voice. "Spino!" "Oh, fine. I'll stop poking fun at you. Just for you," Spino said, finally dropping the act and nuzzling Mabel again. Mabel laughed and continued hugging Spino tightly. "By the way, dinosaur or not, it is really rude to constantly tease your only sister. Maybe from a human perspective, you guys have way too many social norms and boundaries. It's weird and too complicated for me," Spino replied, licking his teeth. "As a dinosaur, I see things much more simply. You filter almost everything you say. I don't feel the need to do that. I simply say what comes to my mind. Life is much easier that way." He looked down at Mabel as he spoke and smiled. She was such a wonderful light in his life, and she had the ability to brighten up the world around her. But she wasn't the only incredible thing to come along in recent years. The community had changed over the decade following the end of the war with the Dino Riders. In fact, all 4 communities had changed. Spino was always happy to offer a helping claw when needed, dragging down trees to a wagon or herding schooling fish towards the fishing nets in the water. He was the only talking dinosaur anyone in the communities had seen, and the only other talking prehistoric reincarnations Spino had ever seen were the Titanoboa and the Rex, although he had only seen one of them speak. Non-talking dinosaurs were also useful. Spino found it amusing when the community started using certain species like horses, cows, or other domesticated animals. Triceratops and Gallimimus were 2 species that proved to be the easiest to domesticate. Domesticating animals was far from the only thing that changed. The walls surrounding the community had been reinforced on several occasions, so it was now much more defensive than its original version. The walls had been expanded, built taller, and fortified to be heavier. Trenches were dug along the outside of the walls, and tunnels were built so they could be accessed from inside the community. There was a series of doors built into the ground like cellar doors that allowed guards to enter the trenches and defend the community from both the ground and the walls in case of an attack. Nick knew that an attack from another group was inevitable and wanted to be ready when it came. There had to be other groups out there somewhere, because it was a big world, and many other people had survived the apocalypse. Just as the crumbling buildings offered a glance into an old world, the common nonverbal dinosaurs and prehistoric fauna offered a similar glimpse into the distant past of millions of years before. And, since all prehistoric life forms had returned, from the powerful Basilosaurus, the iconic woolly mammoth, to the monstrous Giganotosaurus, anyone was able to get a glimpse into what life was like throughout all of time. It made Spino wonder about what life back then was really like, though he'd never know for sure. Just like no one would ever truly know what caused their new world to come about. Whatever the anomaly had been and how it had happened, it didn't matter. It had happened, and those left had to survive in the world it had brought on. Spino looked down when Mabel pulled herself free from his grasp and stretched. "Do you smell that?" she asked. Spino looked up and sniffed the air, and did indeed notice something he hadn't noticed before. While musing about what the world was like during the time of the dinosaurs, he hadn't noticed a new smell in the air. As he sniffed the air again, Mabel sat down at the dinosaur's side and waited to see if he had caught on as well. And he did. He looked down at her and nodded. Rain. "We should probably head back home, right?" Mabel questioned. The sound of distant thunder made Spino nod and stand up. "Yep." Nick walked out of his house and sighed. Even with the bridge repairs successfully finished, he was not relaxed. Being the leader was not all sunshine and rainbows. It was stressful and always tiring. It was something you had to learn to cope with and not let consume your life. That was the hard part. Aside from being someone everyone looked to for guidance, he had many other duties around the community, many of which he'd volunteered for. One such duty was being the one to hold a brief worship service on what the community had decided to be the new Sunday for those in the community who were religious. He also took to educating himself over various religions and spiritual cultures, so he could better serve those in the community who were from various faiths, because he'd learned quickly Christianity wasn't the only religion present within the walls. He often took a voluntary shift on the wall with the guards as well, and, with the many other chores that made up his day, he was busy all the time. The one thing that was so nice about Mabel no longer being a toddler was that she no longer needed him or Susan to watch her all day every day. In fact, she had become rather independent for her age and spent her days with Spino, who was more than happy to play the role of babysitter. Spino always made sure she came home perfectly fine. Spino was like her giant, prehistoric guardian angel. Like he'd been for Nick when the apocalypse was first setting in. However, being the parent of a single independent child was going to change soon. Susan wanted another kid, and she had been persistent about the matter. Nick wasn't so sure he could deal with anything else on his plate right then, but he had given in, and now Susan was due in 8 months. They hadn't announced it yet, not even to Mabel or Spino. The only person who knew about the pregnancy, besides the community's doctor, was Steve, and he was keeping quiet about it. When Nick felt overwhelmed and that he needed to think, he went to the one spot he could always clear his head. Mark's cabin. Nick had built the cabin for Mark just as he had promised he would do before his death. Once the community repairs were underway, Nick stepped aside and built the entire cabin alone. The cabin was something simple but nice. It had one room with a dirt floor, a straw bed, and an earthy, comforting smell. It even had windows, made possible after some scouts for the community found a window store that hadn't been touched by looters. Whenever Nick arrived at the cabin, he'd step inside, close the door, and sit on the straw bed. As he looked around, he admired what he had accomplished for his friend. It was exactly as Mark described it, and Nick knew that Mark would have loved it. In the early days, he'd gotten to know Mark better than anyone in the community. And when Mark was shot, it was hard on Nick, and building Mark's dream cabin was a good distraction. Aside from fulfilling Mark's wish, it helped Nick make peace with the loss of his friend. On the handmade table was an unopened pack of cards. Nick chuckled softly when he saw it, as he remembered how excited Mark was when he suggested playing card games to pass the long evening hours. Nick sighed as he thought of the card games that had never been played in the cabin, of the promised hours of fun that had never been shared. The rumble of thunder shook Nick out of his thoughts, and he went to the window and slid the partially opened curtain aside. The blue sky was rapidly filling with dark clouds. He opened the door, stepped outside of the cabin, and looked up at the sky. Another summer storm was moving in. They seemed to be occurring more often than usual at this time of year. Mabel, get home, he thought. She didn't get home. She and Spino were still walking back to the community when the heavy, stinging rain suddenly descended on them. Along with the downpour, the storm brought powerful gusts of howling wind with it. The rain didn't really bother Spino. He had slept in worse weather. But Mabel was a different matter. She couldn't stay in the downpour long. After a quick search for an abandoned building of any kind that could offer shelter, Spino found nothing. He decided they would stop and wait for the storm to blow over. He crouched down onto all fours, angled his body so it blocked most of the wind and water, and said to Mabel, "We're going to stay here. I don't fancy keeping you out in this weather."
What?
Mabel shouted, her voice barely audible over the wind and rain.
I don't want to stay out in the rain.
Spino sighed as he heard the misery in his sister's voice, and got an idea. Not one he liked, but one he felt would work. He faced Mabel, got close to her, and then looked her right in the eyes. "Yeah, I know." He nudged her gently, his face sympathetic, and after a moment he became very serious. "I can get you out of the rain. Do you trust me?" Caught off guard by his tone, Mabel nodded. "Yeah?" she said. Spino nodded. "Okay. Climb in, then," he replied, and opened his jaws next to her. Mabel visibly tensed. Joking around or playing was one thing, but this was another altogether. This would be practically laying herself out on the dinner plate. After wiping her wet hair out of her eyes and looking Spino in his eyes again, Mabel slowly climbed over his teeth and sat down inside the dinosaur's narrow but large mouth. Mabel shuddered as Spino gently closed his jaws, doing it slowly as if allowing her a final chance to change her mind, forcing her to lie down on her back as they came together. Spino then laid down too, curling himself up to wait out the weather, all the while protecting Mabel the best way he could, given the situation. The sight itself was not too dissimilar to how a mother crocodile carried her hatchlings, and in the old world, it might even have lent credence to a theory proposed by some that Spinosaurus did the same with their own hatchlings. "Sorry. Hopefully it lets up soon," Spino managed to say while keeping his jaws tightly clenched. He felt Mabel roll a tiny bit and touch one of his teeth. "Yeah, hopefully," she said, closing her eyes and trying not to think about being inside the jaws of a Spinosaurus. At least she knew Spino would never actually eat her. And at least he knew better than to make a joke about it at that moment. With her eyes closed, she was able to pretend she was snug in a sleeping bag. A very wet sleeping bag. The size comparison wasn't terribly far off either. Even though Spino was oversized for his species, his jaws were still narrow, small enough to trigger anyone's claustrophobia, in fact. Having seen the massive jaws of a dinosaur close around her had been terrifying on a primal level. But she pushed away the nervousness because it was Spino, her best friend, and her loving and caring dinosaur brother, her fierce protector who always kept her safe, just as he was doing now. Mabel eventually decided that she'd rather sleep to make time go faster, so she kept her eyes closed and tried to snuggle in as best she could. She said, "I think I'm going to try and sleep, Spino. And thanks. This is better than the rain." Spino smiled ever so slightly. Sleep well, he thought, closing his eyes too, but not sleeping. He hoped the rain would pass soon, and he could relieve Mabel of her less than desirable accommodations. The trust that she'd placed in him pleased him. I promised that I would never do anything to hurt you. Ever. He silently swore, a reaffirmation of a promise he had made so many times since he'd first laid eyes on his sister. Nick looked out of his living room window. The storm raged all that day without stopping. Night had fallen, and still there were no signs of the storm relenting, or of his daughter coming home. Well, we might be fixing that bridge again, he thought. He sighed and continued to look outside. Nothing was going to distract him right now, not with Mabel missing. The storm was a bad one. In the old world, he would probably be hearing tornado sirens. Nick knew Spino would do whatever it took to keep Mabel safe, but he was still worried. Susan walked over to him, obviously worried as well, and Nick softly said, "She'll be fine. Spino won't let anything happen to her." Nick tried to reassure her, hugging her close. Susan didn't speak. She just leaned against him and looked outside, hoping for a sign that their daughter was coming home. "Are you sure?" Susan eventually asked. Nick nodded. "Yes. He always protected me when it was just me and him. He'd die for her if that was what it took to keep her safe. We have to trust that he's got her somewhere safe to wait out the weather." When Mabel woke up, she found herself lying against the side of one of Spino's hands, in a manner that his finger was propped up under her head, somewhat like a pillow. The storm was over, and the morning sun was high in the sky. She realized quickly that they'd been outside all night and sat up. "Good morning," Spino greeted her when he saw that she was awake. How'd you sleep?" he asked after a moment. Mabel shrugged. I guess it wasn't too bad. Just a bit constrictive. Hopefully it doesn't happen again, though." Spino chuckled and nudged her with his nose, thankful that she seemed no worse for wear. It seemed that she'd slept far more soundly than he had. "Thank you for trusting me," Spino said. Mabel smiled at him and simply nodded. "All right, come on," Spino continued, standing up. "Let's get you home. You've got to be hungry." "And thirsty," Mabel said as Spino sat her on his neck. "And in need of a change of clothes. You smell like fish," Spino added. "Hey, you're the one who eats it, not me." The trip back went quickly enough, and Mabel was eager to get back and get into some clothes that weren't soaked through with dinosaur saliva. The trip home went without incident, and when they arrived, they met a search party that was just about to leave to look for them. Nick was leading the party, and when he saw his daughter, relief spread across his face. Spino set Mabel on the ground, and she ran to her father, who pulled her into a tight hug. "You're safe," Nick whispered, kissing Mabel on the side of the head. "We were so worried." "I'm okay, Daddy. Spino kept me safe last night," Mabel replied, hugging her father tightly as well. "Your clothes are sticky," Nick mused as they continued hugging. Mabel giggled. "I don't know why," she said, giving Spino a small smile and wink. Spino rolled his eyes as best a dinosaur could in response. Nick noticed the silent interaction and stood up. "You run along. Your mother is worried sick," he then thought to himself. "She doesn't need the extra stress." Out loud, though, he turned to the people in the search party and said, "Okay, I guess we don't have to run all over the forest looking for them now. You can go back to what you were doing. Thank you." Light laughter followed the quip, and everyone turned and walked back through the gate. Some went to start their guard shifts, others headed to return weapons to the community armory. As everyone headed back inside, Mabel among them, Nick looked up at Spino. "Thank you," he said. Spino smiled. "You knew I wouldn't let anything happen to her." "I know, buddy. I know. Thank you. Truly." Two scouts from the community were running through the forest, and they were running fast. They were miles out, trying to find signs of other groups and communities.
There had been recent rumors of there being other communities to the south, after some wayward radio transmissions had been intercepted. New ones and new people to add to the map. Now the two who were sent out to see what they could find were running, panic-stricken, through the deep forest, being stalked by something they didn't understand. "Here!" one of the scouts yelled, and they ducked past some trees and down into a ditch with steep, muddy banks on each side. They pressed themselves against the muddy slopes and prayed. Groaning, one pulled a dart out of his leg, and he suddenly began to feel sick. They hadn't seen who or what was even after them, and the voices they could hear seemed to come from nowhere. "Where'd they get to?" came a voice from up in the trees. It seemed disembodied, like a ghost speaking, because there was no movement or sign of a person speaking anywhere. The forest was completely still. "I don't know. It doesn't matter. We'll find them, their group, and kill them all," the second said. The two scouts pressed themselves tighter against the muddy bank and kept praying. "You seem stressed," Spino said to Nick that night. They were lying side by side in Nick's backyard, looking up at the stars. Nick sighed, turned his head to the side to face Spino. "Yeah, I am. People complaining about this, people complaining about that. There's a problem here, there's a problem there, and I have 2 missing scouts. I think you need to relax." "I can help with that," Spino said. "What?" Nick asked as Spino grabbed him. "Hey!" Spino smirked and remembered the ticklish place on Nick's side he had discovered one night back when he was a baby. Spino lifted his hand and began to lightly rub one of his large claws at the end of his fingers over the spot. "Don't you dare stop, Nick said, beginning to laugh. "You know I'm ticklish there." "Exactly," Spino replied. "You need to laugh more. It does good things for your mood. So, I say you're going to laugh whether you like it or not." Nick tried pushing the dinosaur's hand away, but it was no good. "Come on, Spino, please. I just want to relax, not be assaulted," he said, laughing. "Oh, fine. Another time, then," Spino relented, allowing Nick to sit himself back up. Nick sighed and took a few deep breaths. "The big, vicious Spinosaurus," he mumbled. "More like a laughing-stockosaurus." "Would you rather I be one that wasn't special?" Spino teased, lying his head back down on the grass. "I wouldn't have you any other way," Nick replied, as the back door to his house burst open and a red-faced Susan stepped out. "Nick, inside!" she said furiously. "What's the warden want?" Spino asked. Nick elbowed the dinosaur's nose and stood up. "Oh, shush, this is going to be enjoyable enough without your commentary," he muttered unhappily. "I'm just trying to offer moral support, Professor Sarcasm," Spino called as Nick opened the door and went inside. "Me? Sarcastic? I think you have that backwards," Nick added, shutting the door. Spino laughed again once Nick closed the door, and yawned before lying his head down, ready to catch up on the sleep he missed the night before while watching over Mabel during the storm. Susan sat at the kitchen table, arms crossed, glaring. She looked angry enough to scare away a fully grown Tyrannosaurus Rex. A lantern that sat on the table illuminated the room and her scowl. Nick entered the kitchen and steadied himself. He knew this was going to be bad. "Yes, dear?" Nick gently asked as he sat down across from her. "You want to know what Mabel just told me?" Susan asked. More of a statement and not a request. "What did she say?" Nick tentatively replied, not sure what his wife was getting at. "Mabel told me where she was with your dinosaur yesterday, how he kept her safe during the weather. You want to know what that meat-eater's safe place was?" Sure," Nick shrugged. "Does yesterday matter? She's home and safe." "In his mouth. He kept our daughter in his mouth for the whole damn night!" Susan shouted. "Mabel says it was the only way she could be kept out of the rain. That is some bullshit if I ever heard it. That stupid carnivore had her inside of his mouth for the whole damn night." "Really? This is what you're upset about? She came home just fine. Does it really matter what his method of protection was?" Nick asked. Sometimes he tended to be forgetful that Susan didn't know Spino as well as he did, nor had she ever learned to fully trust him, despite having known for years. "That's what you have to say? Of course it matters! She could have been eaten. He could have eaten our daughter. He's a dinosaur. He eats meat." Susan just couldn't understand why Nick wasn't the slightest bit concerned, and she was beginning to shake from anger, which only increased as she saw Nick's lack of concern. "Okay, I get what you mean. I really do. But listen, while I can't say hearing that has left me thrilled, I trust Spino, because even though he is a carnivore, I know that he would never hurt our daughter. He loves her as much as we do, and it sounds to me like he was doing his best to keep her out of the rain. Hell, some crocodiles do the same thing with their hatchlings. It was thought by some that Spinosaurus did the same thing. And if it ever came down to it, I'd trust Spino the same way Mabel did," Nick said. "You know, I raised Spino from an egg. I know him better than anyone else." "So, I think you're overreacting just a tiny bit. He said it was better to stay where they were, though he didn't exactly tell me what he meant by that. Now I get why. But would you have preferred that he just made her sit out in the rain? I've spent nights in the forest in that exact type of weather, and it's awful. At least she had some shelter. They were in the middle of nowhere." "He told me that much this morning after getting home. It sounded like it was the safest thing for her in the moment," Nick answered, his voice rising but still calm. After that, the family drama concluded with Nick getting kicked out of his own house and told that he could sleep outside with his favorite dinosaur. Not wanting to antagonize his wife further, Nick sighed and elected to just let her have her way. He felt that it would be better for everyone if he just let tempers cool down, so he walked away and headed over to Spino, who had fallen asleep. Nick leaned against Spino's head, and the dinosaur's red eye opened and gazed at his friend. "Did the warden sentence you to a night in the elements?" "She completely flipped out on both of us." "Both?" Spino asked. "Yeah. Mabel decided to come down from her room to try to help my case. I think she just made it worse. So, I'm gonna be the bigger man and just let Susan have her way tonight and try to make peace tomorrow." Nick looked at Spino and continued. "Personally, I think you did the best you could have yesterday." Spino nodded slowly. "Thanks. How'd Mabel take it when you suggested your idea to keep her out of the rain?" "Better than your wife," Spino replied. "Well, that's easy to believe. I've never seen Susan so mad. But I get it. I mean, generally what ends up in a carnivore's mouth does end up as food. She knows you're different, deep down. At least I think she knows. But I also think she doesn't really know you. Not like I do. Once protective Mama Bear wears off, she'll come to her senses. Till then, you're sharing the yard with me? I think giving her some space would be wise," Nick smiled, leaning against the side of Spino's head and closing his eyes. "I'm sure it will get better." "I hope," Spino replied. "And if it helps, Mabel slept like a baby last night." "Well, good, but I don't have any desire to sleep in the same place," Nick replied, making them both laugh. Once they quieted down, Nick patted Spino's nose. "Good night," Nick said, enjoying the cool night air. One night sleeping under the stars would not be so bad, he thought to himself. The next morning, Spino and Nick both woke at the same time, and when Nick found the back door still locked, he decided to spend his time doing a morning inspection of the guard stations along the community walls. He was halfway up the street from his house, rubbing his eyes, when he noticed something near the main gate. One of the missing scouts was back. No longer half asleep, he picked up his pace and ran to the gate. The scout was shouting frantically, and when he saw Nick, he wrestled free from the guards restraining him and threw himself in Nick's face. "Voices! Voices! Voices! We heard voices!" he said, looking around with a crazed look in his eyes. The guards hurried over and continued their unsuccessful efforts to try to calm the man down. Nick grabbed his shoulder and shook him lightly, looking him in the eyes. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, buddy. Calm down." "Tell us what happened," Nick replied in a calming manner. "The trees, they started talking. Voices from everywhere. Voices in the leaves. They sting and talk and kill." "Who? What?" Nick asked. "Trees, mate. The trees," the scout replied in a slightly calmer voice, though the crazed gleam in his eyes remained. Nick continued looking the scout in the eye and slowly stepped back. "Get him some food and water and a place to rest, where the doctors can keep an eye on him." He then looked at the scout again. "We'll talk soon, yeah?" People bringing trade goods from one of the nearby communities, Arnold's community, had disturbing news when they arrived. Hunters from their community were hearing the same phenomena about voices in the trees with no sign of anything speaking anywhere. The traders arrived sickly, saying that they felt sick after they'd been stung, and they'd then found darts on their bodies while riding back along the trade route. And despite it being several hours since the scout returned to the community, he was still only muttering nonsense about the trees and the sting. That was all anyone was able to get out of him for the entire day. And as the day went on, all the traders from Arnold's community who were hit by the darts grew sicker and sicker after only a matter of hours. That afternoon, Nick was in the infirmary, checking in on some of the more critical cases. Shortly after he arrived, many of the ill began to spit up and choke on blood, screaming in pain while holding their stomachs. Everyone hit started simply feeling like they had the flu, but after a few hours they were screaming in pain. The result was that they died after vomiting up huge quantities of their own blood. As this began happening, some took more heed of the words from the first scout, and people began to fear the woods. It became clear that something more cryptic than dinosaurs was lurking about. Not a single witness to the strange occurrences had seen anything. All they could report was that they'd heard voices in the trees. Just voices. They never heard or saw who or what was speaking. Mabel was out of the house and running down the street before Susan could stop her. After kicking Nick out, she put her daughter back to bed, where Mabel had stubbornly stayed all day. After she awoke, Susan had told her that she could never go near Spino again. Overprotective, and now authoritarian, Mama Bear was still out of hibernation, and it made Mabel furious. They had another argument later in the day, and it ended when Mabel ran away from the house. Leaving the front door swinging behind her, Mabel ran down the street and out of the sight of her mother. Mabel had a plan, though. She turned and cut through a neighbor's backyard and ran back to her own. She ran up to Spino, who was jarred from his nap and startled by her sudden appearance. "Hide me," Mabel said as she caught her breath. "What? Where would I do that?" Spino asked, still groggy. Mabel groaned and dove behind his back leg. "I'm not here." Spino sighed, shaking his head to clear the last dredges of sleep from it. "You need to have a talk with your mother, not hide behind my ankle." Mabel just sat against the back of his leg and didn't speak. Spino sighed again and decided to just let her pout for a while. He knew from experience with Nick that heightened emotions never helped solve a tense family dispute. It was best to just let everyone have their space for a while where they could cool off. Then everyone could have a calm discussion. His argument with his wife was no longer on his mind when Nick entered the front door of his house. He was so focused that he didn't even see Susan sitting in the kitchen. He was thinking about the deaths of those who'd arrived with trade goods that morning. They had all died by the late afternoon after being stung by the mysterious darts. "What are you doing here?" Susan asked as Nick walked into the kitchen. He only gave her a sideways glance. "I came to get my gun," he said, walking into their bedroom. He emerged a moment later, strapping a holster onto his belt. His silver pistol reflected the late afternoon sunlight. His tone made Susan pause, and once Nick had his pistol fastened to his belt, he walked towards her. The fight was over as far as he was concerned. "You need to listen," he said as he entered the kitchen. "No, Nick, I don't," Susan shot back. Nick sighed and grabbed his wife by the shoulders. He gently pressed her down to keep her seated and then sat down next to her. "Listen, you can leave this house if you want, or you can stay. You can stay pissed at me for as long as you want. You can shout and scream at me, but you cannot leave the community," Nick firmly said. "Oh, and who says so?" Susan growled. "In fact, I think taking Mabel with me to one of the other towns will do some good. Get her away from you and that dinosaur." "You're not taking my daughter from me. Now, turn off the angry mama bear for 1 second and listen. You can't enter the woods." Nick's voice was rising in frustration. "Listen," he added, speaking quieter. "I say again, leave the house if you want, but you, Mabel, and our unborn baby are not going into those woods." Calmly, he explained everything that had occurred that day to Susan. After a few minutes of silence, Susan asked if they needed any help in the infirmary. She was a part-time nurse for the community and often studied old medical textbooks in her downtime. Although poisons and toxins had not been a subject which she'd spent much time studying, it certainly sounded as if there was a strong possibility that was what had killed the traitors. "No, everyone stung by the darts is dead. I'm guessing that's why our other scout never came back." "Where's Mabel?" Nick replied. Susan explained what had occurred earlier that day. She'd been so steamed in anger, focused on only one issue, that until this moment, she didn't grasp the possible severity of Mabel running out of the house. "Okay, don't panic," Nick said. "I'll find her. She couldn't have left the community. The only way out is through the gate. There's no way that she could have gotten out with all the extra guards I put in place." He stood up and hurried to the back door, unlocking it and going outside. He had a feeling he knew where she was hiding. Like father, like daughter. To be continued. An Ominous Element, an original post-apocalyptic story from the Spinosaurus, read by the author. This concludes the last narration that will follow this plotline. To see how all of this continues and what happens next, be sure to stick around and watch for the release of the published version of the Spinosaurus, coming soon. Waiting time, be sure to give the other narrations a listen, and also check out the video of me talking about the setting and the characters, and all my videos about the books are linked below. The playlist specifically dedicated to the audiobook material has them in chronological order to help out with listening to them. Thanks for listening.